My name is Whitney, and I'm 33 years old. My husband was lying in a coma when his wealthy family boarded a flight to Australia, leaving me in a cold hospital room holding insurmountable debt and forged criminal evidence. But the second their plane took off, the man I thought was dying sat up, ripped off his oxygen mask, and told me we had to run before we were killed. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart people who thought you were entirely powerless. For the last 4 years, I believed I had married into a family that would stick together in a crisis. Growing up in a modest neighborhood outside Chicago, I was taught family meant everything. My parents worked tirelessly, and I applied that same relentless work ethic to my career as a senior corporate forensic auditor. When I met Cameron Kensington, the charismatic younger son of a financial empire, I thought I had found my equal. He distanced himself from his status-obsessed relatives, but lying in that sterile hospital room listening to his ventilator, I realized how naive I had been to think his family would ever accept me. It had been 2 weeks since the horrific car crash that left Cameron in a medically induced coma. I had barely slept, surviving on vending machine coffee. I spent days tracking down doctors and nights holding his cold hand. The Kensington family had treated his catastrophic accident like a minor scheduling conflict. His mother Sylvia visited exactly twice, only complaining about the hospital lighting. His older brother Derek, the golden child groomed to run the firm, was supposedly too busy managing corporate crisis control to answer my desperate calls. The heavy door to the intensive care unit swung open, breaking the agonizing silence. Instead of a nurse, Sylvia marched into the room, wrapped in a pristine camel hair coat and carrying a designer handbag. She did not look at her son. Right behind her came Derek, his tailored suit perfectly pressed, and his wife, Fiona, checking her diamond watch with an expression of intense boredom. There was no shared grief in their eyes. There was only a calculating coldness that made the hairs on my arms stand up. Sylvia stepped right up to the hospital bed, her face a mask of absolute disdain. She unclasped her bag, pulled out a thick manila folder, and dropped it directly onto Cameron's chest. It landed with a heavy thud, right over his barely beating heart. I stared at the folder, confused, before looking back at her perfectly contoured face. "The house is in foreclosure," Sylvia announced, her voice entirely devoid of emotion. "And all of Cameron's medical bills, both past and future, are officially in your name now." I tried to process her words, my exhausted brain struggling to make sense of the sudden cruelty. "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice trembling as I reached out to grab the folder. Sylvia smoothed an invisible wrinkle from her expensive coat. "Derek, Fiona, and I are heading to O'Hare right now. We are boarding a 15-hour flight to Sydney. We are liquidating the Australian branch of the company and starting over completely fresh. You can stay here and play the grieving widow until the bank kicks you out onto the street." I stepped forward, my hands shaking with rising panic. "You cannot just leave. He is your son. He needs us. The doctors say he might wake up." Sylvia scoffed, a harsh sound that echoed off the tiled walls. "He is a liability, Whitney. We protect the strong in this family. You were never one of us. So you can pay the bills or rot in debt. I really do not care." Derek moved closer to me, intentionally invading my personal space. The strong scent of his cologne was suffocating. He leaned in, lowering his voice to a cruel whisper. "You really thought marrying into the Kensington family would upgrade your pathetic middle-class life? You are just a glorified bean counter. Do you even know what your husband did to—" I stepped back, my heart pounding violently. "Cameron is a vegetable because of his own reckless driving." Derek hissed, a sick smile playing on his lips. "And our company is bankrupt because he embezzled millions from the wrong people. The feds are investigating, and the people he stole from are looking for blood. We are leaving before the fallout hits. Have fun taking the fall for him, Whitney. Fiona let out an amused laugh, linking her arm tightly through Derek's. We really must go, darling. Traffic to the airport is going to be terrible, and I refuse to miss our first-class boarding. Without another glance at the man lying broken on the hospital bed, the three of them turned and walked out the door. The sound of Sylvia's heels clicking against the linoleum faded away until I was left completely alone with the steady hum of the life support machines. I stood frozen, staring at the thick folder. I picked it up and opened it with trembling fingers. Inside were foreclosure notices, aggressive billing transfers, and highly complex financial documents explicitly linking my name and Cameron's name to massive fraudulent offshore accounts. As a forensic auditor, my eyes immediately recognized the financial layering. It was a sloppy, desperate attempt to frame us. They had orchestrated a paper trail to make it look like Cameron and I were the masterminds behind the collapse of the Kensington Empire. They were fleeing the country, leaving me as the perfect scapegoat. Instead of crumbling into tears, a sharp anger began to replace my fear. I pulled my phone from my pocket. I knew their exact flight details because Sylvia's assistant had carelessly forwarded me their travel itinerary earlier that week, assuming I was still acting as the obedient family secretary. I opened a flight tracking application and typed in the flight number. The status read boarding. I sat down in the plastic chair beside the bed, my eyes glued to the glowing screen. I watched the status change from boarding to taxiing. I watched the little airplane icon move slowly across the digital runway. Minutes stretched into an agonizing eternity. I did not cry. Crying was for victims, and I refused to be a victim. Finally, the status on my screen flashed green. Departed. They were in the air, trapped in a metal tube completely untouchable for the next 15 hours. I let out a long, shuddering breath, the harsh reality of my isolation fully setting in. I was entirely alone. Right at that exact second, the heart monitor beside me let out a piercing, erratic spike. The rhythmic beeping turned into a rapid, frantic alarm. I jumped up, reaching wildly for the nurse call button, pure panic flooding my system. But before my fingers could graze the red plastic button, a hand shot out from the bed. Fingers clamped down hard around my wrist, gripping me with terrifying, desperate strength. I gasped, stumbling backward, my eyes flying to the hospital bed. Cameron's eyes were wide open. The man who had been completely unresponsive for 2 weeks was staring right at me, his gaze sharp, lucid, and entirely focused. With his free hand, he reached up and ripped the oxygen tube away from his face. He pulled himself up, coughing violently, his chest heaving as he fought for breath. He looked around the room, his eyes wild with a terrifying urgency. "Come with me and get out of here," he rasped, his voice raw and grating. "We have to go right now, or everyone will die." They did not bankrupt the company, Whitney. They stole $80 million from a shadow syndicate, and the cleaners are coming for us right now. I stood, absolutely paralyzed, staring into the desperate, fully conscious eyes of a man I had spent the last 14 days mourning. My mind simply refused to process the impossibility of the moment. The monitor beside me was blaring a chaotic rhythm, but all I could hear was the harsh, ragged sound of Cameron drawing breath after breath on his own. I had watched doctors perform neurological exams with zero response just yesterday. Now he was gripping my arm with a force that bruised his knuckles white with terror. I demanded to know how this was possible, reaching out to touch his face to make sure I was not hallucinating. Cameron swatted my hand away, driven by pure frantic urgency. He told me to stop staring at him like a ghost and listen closely, because we had minutes before the people who controlled the Kensington wealth realized his family had fled the continent. I backed away slowly, trying to reconcile his wild claims with the forged bankruptcy papers still resting on his bed. I told him he was in a coma, that the police said he crashed because he was speeding. Cameron let out a bitter laugh that turned into a wet cough. He swung his legs over the edge of the mattress, looking me dead in the eyes. He said his car did not crash because of speed. It crashed because Derek paid someone to sever the brake lines. 2 days before the accident, Cameron had stumbled into a restricted digital ledger while looking for budget discrepancies. He found $80 million moving through a labyrinth of shell companies. It belonged to an international syndicate that used the Kensington firm as a digital laundromat. When Cameron confronted Derek with the evidence, Derek smiled, offered him a drink, and told him to go home. 30 minutes later, Cameron was trapped inside a vehicle accelerating out of control down a steep embankment. The gravity of his words hit me like a physical blow. I looked down at the manila folder Sylvia had discarded. As a forensic auditor, my mind is trained to find hidden narratives in numbers. I realized the staggering complexity of Derek's setup. He had created an entire fake digital ecosystem using my home IP address and Cameron's secure credentials. It was a masterpiece of corporate framing designed to look perfectly legitimate to federal investigators. They had essentially built a financial coffin, placed us inside, and nailed it shut with our own signatures. They needed a scapegoat for the missing millions once the money vanished. And who better to take the fall than the dead brother and his naive wife? I asked him how he could possibly be awake, how he faked a brain injury, surrounded by medical professionals. Cameron pressed a hand to his ribs, wincing in genuine pain as he forced himself to stand. His legs shook violently. He told me he woke up 3 days after the crash. The first face he saw was Derek, standing over his bed, whispering to a nurse about how unfortunate it would be if Cameron suffered a fatal setback. Cameron realized instantly that Derek had spies inside the hospital network. If they knew he was conscious, they would simply finish the job with a lethal dose of medication disguised as a tragic medical complication. Cameron waited until Derek left and made a desperate plea to the only doctor he trusted, a childhood friend in the neurology department. He bribed his friend to alter his charts, administer mild sedatives that mimicked unresponsiveness, and keep him hidden in plain sight while Derek finalized his escape plan. I felt a wave of profound nausea wash over me. The entire Kensington family had been parading through this room, performing their roles as concerned relatives, all while knowing they had signed our death warrants. Sylvia had complained about the hospital coffee, while fully aware her eldest son had tried to murder her youngest. The depth of their depravity was staggering. Cameron began ripping the intravenous line from the back of his hand. A streak of dark red blood trickled down his skin, splashing onto the pristine white tiles. He ignored it, tearing open the small closet door near the bathroom and pulling out the duffel bag I had packed for myself a week ago. He dumped the contents onto the floor, grabbing a pair of my oversized sweatpants and a dark hooded sweatshirt. He told me to turn off the heart monitor immediately. Taking the monitor offline completely would only send a minor disconnection alert to the nurse's station, giving us a small window of confusion rather than an immediate emergency response. I reached behind the heavy console, my fingers trembling, as I located the primary power switch and flipped it. The blaring alarm abruptly ceased, leaving a sudden, terrifying quiet in the room. Cameron struggled into the clothing, his movements clumsy from weeks of muscle atrophy. I rushed forward to help him. His chest was covered in dark purple bruises, and an angry scar ran down his left side. Seeing the physical evidence of his brother's attempted murder made my blood run cold. This was raw, calculated violence. I zipped up the sweatshirt, pulling the hood over his head to obscure his face. He grabbed me by the shoulders, his grip grounding me. He said Derek would have tipped off the Shadow Syndicate, that the $80 million was gone, and that Cameron had authorized the final transfer before his accident. With Derek and Sylvia safely out of international airspace, the syndicate would send their local fixers to the hospital to extract whatever information they could from me before silencing us both permanently. I grabbed my laptop bag, shoving the thick manila folder of forged foreclosure documents inside. Those papers were no longer just a threat of financial ruin. They were the physical proof of Derek's framing strategy. I told Cameron I had parked my old station wagon near the loading dock at the back of the hospital to avoid paying the daily parking garage fees. For once, my frugal habits were going to save our lives. We moved toward the door, Cameron leaning heavily against my shoulder. Every step required monumental effort, his breathing ragged and shallow. I reached out to grab the stainless steel handle of the heavy wooden door, intending to check the hallway for any passing staff. Before my fingers could make contact with the metal, the handle violently jerked downward on its own. The air in the room suddenly felt incredibly thin. The silence between us was broken only by the soft squeak of rubber-soled shoes pivoting on the linoleum just outside our room. I froze, snatching my hand back as if I had been burned. Cameron immediately pushed me behind him, ignoring his physical weakness to shield my body. We backed away slowly into the dim shadows near the bathroom entrance. Through the frosted rectangular glass of the hospital door, I could clearly make out the silhouettes of two massive figures standing on the other side. They were completely still, their broad shoulders blocking out the fluorescent hallway lights. They were not doctors. They moved with a synchronized, terrifying precision. The handle rattled again, much harder this time, followed by the distinct sound of a heavy shoulder testing the strength of the hinges. The cleaners had arrived. The heavy metal handle clicked sharply downward, and the door swung inward with a slow, deliberate creak. Two men stepped into the dim light of the hospital room, both wearing standard-issue blue scrubs that stretched uncomfortably across their massive chests. They did not carry clipboards or medication trays. Their eyes were cold, entirely devoid of the exhausted empathy you normally see in medical professionals. The taller of the two immediately reached his right hand beneath the neckline of his scrub top, his fingers wrapping around the dark grip of a suppressed weapon. Cameron shoved me harder into the narrow alcove by the bathroom, his body trembling violently as he tried to form a physical barricade between me and the intruders. He was running on pure adrenaline and sheer willpower, but I could see his legs failing. He was in no condition to fight off one trained killer, let alone two. The men advanced silently, their rubber soles making absolutely no sound on the linoleum. They expected to find a helpless woman weeping over a comatose husband. Instead, they found an empty bed, the sheets thrown back, the monitor intentionally powered down. The confusion cost them exactly 3 seconds. The shorter man gestured toward the bathroom shadows, realizing we were backed into the corner. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird, but the panic that had consumed me just moments ago suddenly vanished. In its place, a cold, surgical clarity took over. Sylvia and Derek had underestimated me because they thought I was just a meek girl who played with spreadsheets. They did not realize that understanding digital architecture meant understanding how the physical world was wired together. I dropped to my knees, sliding my laptop out of my bag. Right behind the life support console was a red Ethernet port, a dedicated localized network access point meant for medical technicians to run diagnostic updates on the intensive care unit's grid. I shoved my connection cable into the wall port and flipped my screen open. Cameron looked down at me, his breathing ragged, asking what on earth I was doing. The two men were crossing the room now, the taller one raising his weapon, his eyes locking onto Cameron. I did not answer my husband. My fingers flew across the keyboard, bypassing the ridiculously outdated security firewall of the hospital administrative network. I accessed the ward environmental controls in less than 10 seconds. The men were 5 feet away. The taller one raised his arm, aiming directly at Cameron's chest. I hit the execute command. Every single light on the entire intensive care floor instantly shattered into darkness. The sudden pitch-black blindness caused the men to stumble, swearing loudly as they lost their visual target. But I was not finished. I triggered the emergency fire suppression protocols. A deafening, localized fire alarm began shrieking through the ceiling speakers, a sound so loud and jarring it made the floorboards vibrate. A second later, the overhead sprinkler system erupted. Freezing cold water blasted down into the room, soaking everything in an instant. The sudden deluge hit the men hard, blinding them further, and turning the smooth linoleum floor into a treacherous, slippery mess. One of the men slipped his heavy frame, crashing hard into the metal side of the hospital bed. "Grab my shoulder!" I yelled to Cameron over the shrieking alarm. We moved together, slipping past the disoriented cleaners in the chaotic darkness. The freezing water plastered my hair to my face as we pushed through the heavy door and out into the hallway. The entire corridor was an absolute pandemonium. Red emergency strobes flashed frantically through the artificial rain. Real nurses and doctors were shouting, rushing out of rooms, trying to understand where the fire was. We blended perfectly into the panicked crowd, keeping our heads down as we moved as fast as Cameron could manage toward the service elevators. We could not take the main stairs. The cleaners would recover quickly and lock down the standard exits. We reached the end of the hall, but the service elevator was locked in emergency mode due to the fire alarm. I looked wildly around the dead-end corridor and spotted the heavy metal door labeled "Soiled Linens." I yanked it open, revealing the wide aluminum chute that dropped directly into the hospital basement laundry facility. It was a straight vertical drop, intended only for heavy canvas bags of sheets and scrubs. I looked at Cameron, water dripping from his bruised face. "We have to slide," I told him, grabbing the edges of the metal frame. He did not hesitate. He swung his legs over the edge, crossed his arms over his injured chest, and let himself go. I heard the hollow metallic echo of his body sliding down the shaft. I threw my laptop bag down after him, took a deep breath, and jumped. The slide was steep and terrifying, the metal cold against my skin. I tumbled out of the bottom of the chute, landing hard on a massive pile of damp hospital sheets. Cameron was already rolling off the pile, clutching his ribs, his face pale with agony. We scrambled to our feet, slipping out of the laundry room and into the cavernous concrete basement of the building. The loading dock was just ahead. The heavy, rolling doors cracked open to let in the freezing night air. We ran, our wet shoes squeaking loudly against the cement. Bursting through the loading dock doors, the bitter Chicago wind hit us like a physical blow. There, tucked behind a row of industrial dumpsters, was my battered 10-year-old station wagon. I had parked it in the delivery zone 2 weeks ago, slipping the lot attendant $50 to ignore it because I refused to pay the exorbitant daily garage fees while my husband fought for his life. Now that stubborn frugality was our only lifeline. I unlocked the doors with my key fob, throwing my wet laptop bag into the back. Cameron practically collapsed into the passenger seat, groaning in pain as he pulled his legs inside. I jumped behind the wheel, jamming the key into the ignition. The old engine sputtered for a terrifying second before roaring to life. I threw the car into drive and slammed my foot on the gas, tearing out of the loading dock alley just as the heavy basement doors burst open behind us. I did not look back. I merged aggressively onto the damp city streets, weaving through the late-night traffic, putting as much distance as possible between us and the hospital. The adrenaline was beginning to wear off, leaving my hands shaking violently against the steering wheel. The silence in the car was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic squeak of the windshield wipers pushing the rain away. Cameron slumped against the window, his chest rising and falling in shallow, painful gasps. He turned his head slowly, looking at me with a mixture of profound exhaustion and deep guilt. He swallowed hard, his voice barely a whisper over the sound of the engine. "I am so sorry, Whitney," he said, his eyes filled with genuine remorse. "I never should have let you get close to my family. You are just a boring accountant. You should be balancing spreadsheets in some safe, quiet office, not running for your life from a shadow syndicate because of my brother's lethal mess." I tightened my grip on the steering wheel. my eyes fixed firmly on the road ahead. The fear that had gripped me in that hospital room was completely gone now. In its place was a sharp, calculating focus. I hit the turn signal, taking a sharp left toward an off-the-grid industrial sector of the city. "I am not a boring accountant, Cameron," I said, my voice steady and cold. "I am a senior corporate forensic auditor, and I've been tracking your brother's dirty money for 6 months." Cameron stared at me through the dim light of the street lamps flashing across the windshield. The silence in the car stretched out heavy with the weight of my confession. He blinked repeatedly, his mind clearly struggling to reconcile the docile wife he thought he knew with the woman currently driving a stolen getaway vehicle through the rainy streets of Chicago. He opened his mouth to speak, but another violent coughing fit seized his chest. He clutched his broken ribs, squeezing his eyes shut in pure agony. I kept my eyes focused on the road, taking a sharp turn down a desolate industrial corridor to avoid the main avenues, where police cruisers were more likely to patrol. The freezing rain pounded against the roof of the old station wagon, masking the sound of our frantic escape. I checked the rearview mirror for the 10th time in 2 minutes. The road behind us remained empty, but I knew the syndicate cleaners would not give up that easily. Derek had undoubtedly paid them a fortune to ensure there were no loose ends. I told Cameron to focus on breathing and save his strength. We had a long night ahead of us, and I needed him alive to help me dismantle his family, piece by piece. He leaned his head against the cold glass of the passenger window, his breathing slowly returning to a ragged, painful rhythm. He asked how long I had known about the offshore accounts and the shadow syndicate. I let out a dry, humorless laugh, the sound carrying a bitterness I had been swallowing for years. I told him I started noticing the financial discrepancies shortly after our wedding, but the real digging began 6 months ago. I reminded him of the disastrous Thanksgiving dinner at his mother's sprawling estate in the affluent suburbs. We were sitting around that massive mahogany dining table, surrounded by crystal glasses and expensive catered food. Sylvia had asked me about my recent promotion at the firm, her tone dripping with that trademark Kensington condescension. Before I could even answer, Derek had leaned over his plate with a mocking smirk. He looked right at me, swirled his $1,000 glass of wine, and asked if forensic auditing just meant I double-checked other people's math for a living. Sylvia had laughed out loud at that, patting my hand across the table, as if I were a small child playing dress-up in a corporate world. Fiona had chimed in, suggesting I should just quit my job and join her on the charity gala planning committee, since my salary was basically pocket change to them anyway. They had spent the entire evening treating my career like a trivial, amusing hobby. They completely dismissed the fact that my entire professional existence revolved around finding the invisible digital footprints that corrupt executives leave behind when they think no one is looking. They truly thought I was just a quiet girl calculating boring spreadsheets. Their sheer arrogance was their absolute greatest vulnerability. It meant they never bothered to hide their digital tracks from me when I visited the family estate. Derek routinely left his laptop open and connected to the home network. They practically handed me the keys to their financial kingdom because they assumed I was too simple-minded to understand how the locks worked. Cameron listened in stunned silence as I navigated a series of winding back alleys, moving deeper into a warehouse district that the city had largely abandoned decades ago. The streetlights here were mostly broken, casting long, menacing shadows across the wet pavement. He asked why I never told him what I was doing, why I never warned him that I was investigating his own brother. I glanced at him, my expression softening just a fraction, as I saw the profound betrayal etching lines into his pale face. I told him I wanted to be absolutely certain before I accused his own flesh and blood of international financial crimes. I was gathering irrefutable proof, building a quiet, meticulous case that would hold up in a federal court. I knew Cameron loved his family, despite their flaws, and I needed hard evidence before I shattered his world. But then 2 weeks ago, the police knocked on our apartment door at 3 in the morning. They told me my husband had lost control of his vehicle on a dry, perfectly straight road, wrapping his car around a concrete embankment. The local authorities called it a tragic, inexplicable accident. I knew the exact moment I saw the mangled wreckage of his vehicle that it was nothing of the sort. I told Cameron that, while his family was pretending to mourn him in the hospital lobby, putting on a grand theatrical performance for the doctors, I went back to our apartment and tore into the Kensington corporate servers. I did not sleep for 4 days straight. While he was lying in a medically induced coma, fighting for every single breath, I used every top-tier skill I possessed to digitally infiltrate his family's entire financial architecture. It took massive effort and endless pots of black coffee, but I finally broke through Derek's encrypted firewalls. I mapped out every single hidden shell company his brother had created over the last 5 years. I traced the flow of money from legitimate Kensington assets directly into offshore ghost accounts located in the Cayman Islands and Switzerland. That was the moment I found the Shadow Syndicate. I watched $80 million move through a highly sophisticated digital labyrinth specifically designed to wash the dirty money clean before routing it back into legitimate corporate holdings. Derek was playing a highly dangerous game, acting as a digital middleman for people who do not hesitate to kill anyone who gets in their way. And when Cameron got too close to the truth, Derek coldly decided to sacrifice his own brother to cover his tracks and save his own skin. The raw reality of his family's betrayal seemed to settle over Cameron all at once. The physical pain of his injuries paled in comparison to the emotional devastation radiating from him. He closed his eyes, a single tear slipping down his bruised cheek, mingling with the rainwater that still clung to his face. I reached across the center console and briefly squeezed his shoulder, offering the only comfort I could in a situation that defied all logic and decency. I slowed the station wagon as we approached a formidable, unmarked brick building surrounded by a high chain-link fence topped with razor wire. This was an off-the-grid industrial garage I had secured under a dummy corporation months ago. It was originally intended just as a secure, climate-controlled location for my physical servers and sensitive audit backups. Now it was our only sanctuary in a city crawling with syndicate cleaners. I pulled up to the heavy corrugated metal door and clicked a remote transmitter attached to my sun visor. The heavy door rolled upward with a loud mechanical grind that echoed in the empty street. I drove the car inside, plunging us into the dry concrete interior, and immediately hit the button to seal the steel door shut behind us. I killed the engine, the sudden silence in the garage ringing loudly in my ears. I unbuckled my seatbelt, grabbed my soaking wet laptop bag from the back seat, and hurried around to the passenger side to help Cameron out of the car. He leaned heavily on my shoulder as we walked toward the back of the massive garage, his steps slow and agonizing. I reached out and flipped a master switch on the concrete wall. A row of massive high-tech server racks immediately hummed to life, their cooling fans kicking on with a low, steady roar. The blue and green LED lights from the hardware illuminated the dark space, casting an eerie technological glow across the room. A massive steel desk sat in the center of the space, supporting multiple high-resolution monitors, a dedicated power supply, and an encrypted master laptop. Cameron stood in the center of the room, staring at the highly sophisticated setup in absolute awe. He was finally realizing the true extent of my capabilities and the sheer magnitude of the trap I had been silently building for his family. I guided him to a comfortable leather chair, easing him down so he could rest his battered ribs. I grabbed a first aid kit from a nearby metal shelf and tossed it onto his lap before walking around to the command center. I placed my hands flat on the cool metal surface of my desk, feeling the familiar, intoxicating rush of adrenaline that came with a pure digital hunt. They thought they could destroy us and fly away to a new life without a single consequence. I looked at the dark screens in front of me, ready to bring the entire Kensington empire crashing down to the ground. They left the wrong woman holding the bag, I said, cracking open my master laptop. The instant the master laptop came alive, I switched from escape mode to evidence mode. The server wall behind me filled the garage with a low mechanical roar, and 4 monitors opened to dashboards I had built over the previous 6 months. Cameron tried to rise from the leather chair, but his knees buckled. I caught him under the arm and forced him back down. His skin was gray, his pulse too fast, and the wound where he had torn out the intravenous line was still bleeding through the sleeve of my sweatshirt. Before I could dismantle his family, I had to make sure he survived long enough to testify against them. I opened the first aid kit and pressed sterile gauze into his hand. I told him to hold it firmly against the puncture while I checked the bruising along his ribs. He protested that we did not have time. I told him dead witnesses were useless and reckless heroes were even worse. The sharpness in my voice stopped him. He obeyed, breathing through his teeth, while I wrapped his wrist, checked his pupils, and connected a portable oxygen monitor from the emergency cabinet. His readings were weak but stable. The doctor who had hidden his consciousness had left a sealed packet in my laptop bag, with medication instructions, imaging summaries, and a warning that Cameron could move only in short bursts. I placed the packet beside him and made him promise to speak up if the pain changed. Then I turned toward the screens. The Kensington architecture was already mirrored inside my private forensic environment. For 6 months, I had not simply collected screenshots. I had preserved transaction hashes, access logs, authentication records, device certificates, and time-synchronized copies of every ledger Derek touched. Each item was stored in a read-only evidence vault, with an automated chain of custody. If federal agents examined my work, they would be able to see when each file had been collected, how it had been preserved, and whether a single byte had changed. Derek believed complexity was the same thing as security. It was not. Complexity merely gave guilty people more places to leave fingerprints. I pulled up a 3-dimensional flow map. Thin lines spread across the monitors like veins connecting Kensington subsidiaries in Chicago to consulting firms in Delaware, shipping companies in Panama, private foundations in Liechtenstein, and 6 Cayman entities that existed only on paper. Cameron stared at the map in horrified silence. He recognized the names of 2 companies that Derek had repeatedly described as harmless expansion vehicles. I enlarged one of them and showed him the payment pattern. Every legitimate Kensington transfer was followed within 90 seconds by a second transfer of nearly the same amount divided into irregular fragments and routed through unrelated vendors. Those fragments were later recombined overseas. It was classic layering, disguised beneath enough legitimate commerce to survive a casual audit. The $80 million had not yet reached Derek's final account. It was moving through the last stage of the laundering sequence, broken into 12 separate transfers scheduled to settle within the next 11 minutes. That delay was the only reason we still had a chance. Derek had designed the final movement to begin after his plane entered international airspace. He assumed Cameron would remain unconscious, I would be trapped under forged debt, and no one with authority would notice the money until he was safely in Australia. Cameron leaned forward and asked whether I could simply stop the wires. I told him stopping them without preserving the route would warn Derek and destroy the clearest evidence against him. We needed the money, the metadata, and the identities behind every authorization. I opened a second monitor containing a controlled recovery account I had prepared through my firm's emergency fraud response system. It was not a personal account, and it was not a place where I could spend a cent. It was an encrypted holding environment designed to quarantine disputed corporate funds until regulators or a court determined ownership. The account had independent logs, immutable timestamps, and an automatic lock that would activate the moment the transfer arrived. To reach it, I needed two things Derek thought no one else possessed. The first was the recovery certificate from the Kensington Treasury server. The second was Cameron's executive authentication key. Derek had copied Cameron's credentials for the fraudulent transfers, but he had never realized the same key could revoke them if the real holder challenged the transaction during settlement. I looked at Cameron and asked whether he remembered the emergency phrase tied to his biometric token. He closed his eyes, forcing his exhausted mind to work. For several agonizing seconds, all I heard was the ventilation system and the rain striking the metal roof. Then he opened his eyes and recited 6 words his father had made both sons memorize years earlier. I entered the phrase. A verification window appeared, demanding a live response from Cameron. I rotated a small camera toward him. His bruised face filled the authentication frame. The system asked him to repeat a random sentence and turn his head so the biometric software could confirm that the image was not pre-recorded. He completed the challenge through clenched teeth. The screen flashed amber. Executive identity confirmed. Recovery authority pending. That was when Derek's countermeasure activated. A warning spread across the center monitor. Someone aboard the Sydney flight had initiated an emergency override trying to accelerate all 12 transfers before the normal settlement window. Derek had checked the accounts earlier than I expected. He was attempting to force the money through while the aircraft network bounced between satellite relays, hoping the changing connection would blur his location. The transfer countdown dropped from 9 minutes to less than 3. I launched the recovery certificate and met his override inside the transaction queue. For a few seconds, the screen became a violent contest of authorization requests. Derek's commands arrived under Cameron's stolen identity. Mine carried Cameron's live biometric verification and the original Treasury recovery key. The banking nodes rejected both sides while they compared the credentials. Cameron watched the countdown falling and asked what would happen if Derek won. I told him the $80 million would disappear into a private account controlled by the syndicate's brokers, while every visible record would identify Cameron as the thief. Derek would land rich, the syndicate would hunt us, and the federal government would prosecute whoever survived. The final settlement clock reached 40 seconds. I stopped trying to block Derek's commands and instead opened the forensic mirror I had built around his device. Every time he submitted the stolen credentials, my system copied the request, including the aircraft network address, his tablet certificate, and the hardware identifier unique to his machine. He was producing the evidence faster than I could have collected it myself. I let him believe he was winning until all 12 transfers showed his personal device as the active source. At 20 seconds, I submitted Cameron's live revocation. The first transfer froze. Then the second. One by one, the 12 settlement lines changed from green to amber. Derek fought back, hammering the system with repeated approvals, but each attempt only generated another signed record. At 7 seconds, the recovery account opened. At 3, the banking nodes recognized the real executive key. At 1, every transfer reversed direction. The monitors erupted with confirmation notices. 12 streams of money converged into the locked recovery account, reconstructing the complete $80 million down to the cent. The account sealed itself immediately. No withdrawal could occur without joint approval from federal regulators and the originating financial institutions. I copied the full transaction history into my evidence vault and attached a concise index identifying the shell companies, the stolen credentials, and the exact device Derek had used from the airplane. Cameron released a breath that sounded almost like a sob. He asked whether the syndicate would think we had stolen from them now. I told him they would see the money had been quarantined, but they would also need proof of who had taken it in the first place. I opened the dossier I had been assembling since the investigation began. It included Sylvia's private network address, Derek's tablet certificate, the forged corporate resolutions, the staged debt transfers, and the original authorization trail. I embedded a read-only copy into the recovery account's transaction metadata, signed with my professional forensic certificate. Anyone tracing the missing funds would find the evidence before they found us. Then, I created a second package for law enforcement. This version contained the clean chain of custody Cameron's live revocation and the complete sequence showing Derek attempting to force the wires through from 30,000 feet over the Pacific. I did not send it yet. I placed it behind a timed release ready to go the moment we confirmed which agencies could protect us from the syndicate's local cleaners. The final confirmation turned bright green. The $80 million was secured. Derek's theft was documented in his own digital handwriting, and Cameron's identity had been separated from every fraudulent authorization. For the first time since the crash, the financial coffin Derek had built around us had an open door. I looked at Cameron and told him his brother had just lost the money, the frame job, and the only advantage he believed he possessed. Now we were going to let him discover that loss while he was trapped in the sky. I leaned back in my leather chair, letting out a slow breath as the confirmation message flashed green on my screen. The syndicate money was secured, but my work was far from over. I pulled up a secondary tracking program I had designed specifically for this moment. I needed to know exactly what Derek was doing. I knew Sylvia, Derek, and Fiona were already aboard a commercial luxury flight bound for Sydney, a 15-hour journey across the Pacific. I accessed the International Aviation Tracking Database, locating their specific aircraft, currently cruising at 30,000 feet over the open water. I routed my connection through a satellite uplink targeting the commercial in-flight wireless network provided for first-class passengers. It was notoriously expensive and surprisingly vulnerable to an outside breach. I watched the network traffic logs scrolling down my right monitor. I waited for a specific device identifier. Derek was a creature of habit. He never went long without checking his financial status. I knew he could not resist the urge to look at his stolen fortune. 10 minutes passed in agonizing silence. Cameron shifted uncomfortably in his chair, wincing as his broken ribs flared with pain. He asked me if I really thought Derek would log on. I told him to be patient, keeping my eyes locked on the scrolling data. Suddenly, a familiar media access control address pinged the network. Derek had purchased the premium in-flight wireless package and connected his personal tablet to the internet. I had him. I wanted to see the exact look on his face when his entire world collapsed. I ran a localized exploit I had prepared for his specific tablet model, silently overriding the device permissions. Within seconds, I bypassed his security protocol and activated the front-facing lens of his tablet, routing the live video feed to my center monitor. The image flickered for a brief moment before resolving into a clear, high-definition stream. Derek was sitting in a spacious, reclining first-class seat, a glass of champagne resting on his tray table. He looked incredibly relaxed, a smug, victorious smile plastered across his face. Beside him, Fiona was flipping through a luxury real estate magazine, pointing out massive beachfront properties in Australia. Across the aisle, Sylvia was sipping her own drink, looking as though she had not a care in the world. I activated the tablet microphone, the ambient hum of the airplane engines filling the quiet garage. I could hear Derek gloating loudly to his mother and his wife. He was bragging about how flawlessly the plan had worked, boasting that the authorities would spend years trying to untangle the financial mess he had left behind in Chicago. He told Sylvia that by the time anyone realized the money was truly gone, they would be untraceable billionaires living on a private coastline. He chuckled a cruel, heartless sound and said he almost felt sorry for the naive little bean counter who was currently taking the fall for his brilliance. Cameron heard the audio pouring from the laptop speakers and clenched his fists, his jaw tight with profound anger. I reached out and gently touched his arm, telling him the show was just about to begin. I watched on the high-definition screen as Derek confidently tapped his tablet's screen, bringing up the secure banking application he used to monitor the Cayman accounts. He typed in his master password, eager to see the $80 million safely deposited. I waited until the exact second the application attempted to authenticate his credentials. I hit the enter key on my master laptop. I completely intercepted his connection. I severed his access to the banking servers and seized total administrative control of his tablet. On my video feed, I saw Derek frown in confusion as his banking application abruptly closed. His screen went entirely black. He tapped the glass frantically, thinking the device had glitched. A second later, a single line of bright white text appeared in the center of his dark screen. I had typed the message myself. "Hope you enjoyed the flight. The landing is going to hurt." Signed, the bean counter. The color drained from Derek's face with alarming speed. He stared at the glowing white text, his smug smile vanishing, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated terror. He gasped, his hands shaking violently as he realized exactly who had compromised his device. He frantically swiped at the screen, trying to force the tablet to reboot, trying to close out of the message, but the device was completely locked. It was a digital brick. Panic set in immediately. I watched him drop the tablet onto his tray table, knocking over his expensive champagne in the process. The liquid spilled across his tailored trousers, but he did not even notice. He lunged into his jacket pocket and pulled out his primary smartphone. He desperately tried to access his secondary offshore accounts, hoping he could manually transfer whatever funds he had left into an untraceable crypto wallet. But I was already 3 steps ahead of him. The moment his phone connected to the airplane network, I executed a complete denial of service attack on all his personal devices. I watched through the tablet camera as his phone screen also went black, locking him out of every single financial avenue he possessed. He was completely disconnected from his own digital life. He was trapped in a metal tube, 30,000 feet over the Pacific Ocean, completely powerless, with absolutely nowhere to run or hide from the nightmare I was unleashing. I sat back in my leather chair and watched the video feed, observing the moment Sylvia's shock hardened into survival instinct. She was a woman who had spent her adult life manipulating the narrative, and she was not about to surrender without a fight. She shoved her hands into her designer bag and pulled out her smartphone. I saw the device register on my network monitoring software. I could have severed her connection, plunging her into the same digital blackout her son and daughter-in-law were experiencing, but tactical instinct told me to wait. I wanted to see what kind of desperate strategy she would attempt. I tapped a few keys, mirroring her phone display onto a secondary monitor in the garage. Cameron leaned closer to the screen, breathing shallowly as he watched his mother type furiously on her device. She went straight to her corporate email client. She composed a message marked with high priority flags, addressing it to the Kensington firm board of directors and their public relations managers. Her thumbs flew across the keyboard, weaving a tapestry of absolute lies. She wrote that she and Derek had just uncovered a massive financial conspiracy within the company. She claimed Cameron had embezzled tens of millions of dollars to fund a secret gambling syndicate, and that his recent car crash was a staged event designed to fake his injuries. She wrote he was on the run, armed and dangerous, actively attempting to frame his innocent older brother to cover his tracks. It was a breathtaking display of maternal betrayal. She was not just throwing him under the bus to save herself. She was systematically destroying his professional reputation and his fundamental humanity. She did not stop with the corporate board. She opened her social media accounts platforms where she commanded tens of thousands of followers. She drafted a public post adopting the tone of a heartbroken, devastated mother. She pleaded for anyone with information about her dangerous rogue son to contact the authorities immediately. She painted Derek as the valiant hero, saving the family business from a sibling who lost his mind to greed. I watched the post go live, instantly broadcasting to the world that Cameron Kensington was a criminal mastermind. I turned to look at Cameron. He was staring at the monitor, his eyes wide and vacant, his face drained of color. The physical pain of his broken ribs was nothing compared to the profound agony of watching his own mother publicly assassinate his character. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. He sat there completely broken by the people who were supposed to protect him unconditionally. He reached a trembling hand toward the monitor, as if he could reach through the glass and ask her why she was doing this. I caught his hand, gently pulling it back. I told him not to look at the screen anymore. I told him the woman typing those messages was not a mother, but a cornered animal lashing out blindly because she knew the trap was closing in. Cameron let out a ragged breath, asking me what we were supposed to do now. He said the board would believe her because she had decades of established credibility. He said the authorities would issue warrants, and we would spend the rest of our lives defending ourselves against a lie that had circled the globe. I felt a surge of fierce protective anger burn through my veins. Sylvia thought she could control reality simply by speaking her lies loud enough for everyone to hear. She thought public relations spin could override forensic accounting. She was operating under the archaic assumption that whoever controls the narrative controls the truth. I was about to teach her a masterclass in modern digital reality. I turned away from the video feed and pulled up a secured, encrypted folder stored deep within my master server. I told Cameron I had no intention of arguing with his mother on social media. I was not going to issue a desperate public statement or beg the corporate board to listen to our side of the story. Defensive arguments only validate the accuser. Instead of fighting a public relations battle, I was going to drop a nuclear bomb of indisputable truth directly onto the desks of the people who actually mattered. I opened the folder, revealing lines of unedited, raw audit logs that I had meticulously compiled over the last 6 months. These were the foundational building blocks of the Kensington corporate server traffic. I pulled up the digital ledger tracking the $80 million moving into the Shadow Syndicate accounts. I highlighted the authorization signatures. I showed Cameron the irrefutable data points that linked every single fraudulent transfer directly to Derek's private computer, his personal network, and his unique biometric login credentials. There was no ambiguity. The numbers told a cold, precise story that no amount of social media spinning could ever undo. I drafted a new email using a secure, untraceable routing protocol. I attached the complete audit logs, the IP address verifications, the Shadow Syndicate account routing numbers, and the digital fingerprint showing exactly how Derek had tried to forge Cameron's name. I did not just address this email to the Kensington Board of Directors. A corporate board might try to bury the evidence to protect the company's stock price and avoid a massive public scandal. I needed this information in the hands of people who possessed the absolute authority to tear the Kensington empire down to its studs. I added the secure intake addresses for the Securities and Exchange Commission Enforcement Division. I added the primary investigation routing addresses for the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Unit. I looked at Cameron, my finger hovering over the send button. I told him that once I executed this command, there was no going back. His family would not just face a corporate scandal or a simple bankruptcy. They would face the full, unyielding wrath of the federal government. They would be hunted for tax evasion, wire fraud, and international money laundering. I asked him if he was absolutely certain he wanted me to cross this line. Cameron looked at the screen where his mother's social media post was currently racking up hundreds of sympathetic comments from their wealthy friends. He looked at the lies she had effortlessly spun to destroy his life. He turned back to me, his jaw set with a newfound, unshakable resolve. He told me to burn it all down. I pressed the key. The massive data dump launched into cyberspace, silently delivering the absolute truth to the highest federal authorities in the nation. The corporate board of directors would open their emails, expecting to read Sylvia's frantic claims about a rogue son. Instead, they would find a meticulously organized prosecution file proving their golden child was an international criminal and their matriarch was an active conspirator. The Securities and Exchange Commission would see a clear, undeniable map of staggering financial fraud. The Internal Revenue Service would see decades of systemic tax evasion laid bare. I leaned back and watched the delivery confirmations light up my screen one by one. Sylvia had tried to strike back with a carefully crafted lie, but I had just countered with a mountain of truth that would bury her forever. The delivery confirmations were still glowing when I opened the final branch of my financial map. The $80 million belonged to the syndicate and had to remain locked for investigators, but Derek and Sylvia had built their arrogance on another source of power, the Kensington family's legitimate wealth. They believed their personal trusts, private investment accounts, and generational assets could never be touched by a corporate scandal. That belief was the foundation of their confidence aboard the plane. I intended to remove it. Cameron saw the new accounts appear and immediately asked whether I was planning to steal his family's lawful money. I told him no. I had spent my career exposing people who treated theft as strategy. I would not become one of them. What Derek and Sylvia called untouchable wealth was tied to a network of revocable trusts, corporate guarantees, tax shelters, and charitable foundations. Over the previous 5 years, they had repeatedly pledged those assets as security for Kensington obligations, while publicly pretending the trusts were separate. Derek had then used fraudulent board resolutions to borrow against them. Once the board and regulators received my evidence those guarantees could be enforced, the distributions frozen, and the concealed obligations brought into the light. I opened the trustee portal using credentials lawfully preserved during my audit, and uploaded the board notification, the raw transaction logs, and the emergency fraud report. I did not issue transfers. I triggered the contractual protections Derek himself had approved when he used the family trusts as collateral. Automated notices went to the independent trustees, the corporate insurer, and outside counsel. Within seconds, every discretionary distribution to Sylvia and Derek changed from available to suspended pending investigation. The first account was Sylvia's personal reserve, the one that paid for her estate staff, private drivers, and endless social events. She had routed Kensington reimbursement payments into it for years, labeling them as consulting fees. I marked the disputed deposits and attached the corresponding company invoices. The bank's compliance system froze the entire account rather than risk allowing criminal proceeds to move. Her available balance fell to zero. Next came Derek's Dynasty Trust. He had boasted that no court could reach it, but 6 months earlier, he had signed a personal guarantee, using the trust's annual distributions to secure the Australian expansion. The guarantee included an automatic suspension clause if fraud or flight risk was reported. I sent the proof. The trustee acknowledged the notice and locked every scheduled payment. The principal remained protected for judicial review, but Derek could not access $1, borrow against it, or use it to fund his escape. Fiona's vanity companies were easier. Her event business, luxury lifestyle brand, and so-called charitable consultancy were not independent enterprises at all. They were fed almost entirely by Kensington transfers approved by Derek. I matched the incoming payments to false vendor invoices and sent the package to the bank's fraud departments. One account after another shifted into restricted status. The credit lines were canceled. The stored cards were suspended. The money she considered personal spending cash became evidence. I then opened the family foundation. Sylvia had used it as a stage prop, posing for photographs beside oversized checks while delaying the actual disbursements for months. Hidden in the foundation records were several irrevocable grants already approved by its board, but never released because Sylvia preferred keeping the cash invested. Those grants were lawful obligations. Once the independent foundation administrator saw the evidence that Sylvia was fleeing and the assets were at risk, he authorized the overdue payments. Funds moved to a Chicago domestic violence shelter, a children's rehabilitation hospital, and a legal aid program for families facing fraudulent debt. At Cameron's request, the grants were issued without publicity and without the Kensington name attached. The people who needed the money would receive it. Sylvia would receive no applause. Cameron watched the balances disappear from the available column. His expression was not triumphant, it was mournful. He told me those accounts had paid for every childhood holiday, every family dinner, and every symbol of security he had known. I reminded him the building's photographs and expensive traditions had never protected him when his life became inconvenient. Wealth had only given his relatives better tools for abandoning him. A notification appeared from the airline network. Derek had borrowed Fiona's phone and was attempting to purchase another premium connection package. The card failed. He tried a second card linked to the family office. It failed too. Through the compromised tablet camera, we watched him summon a flight attendant and order a bottle of rare champagne, trying to prove to Sylvia that the problem was temporary. The attendant entered the purchase. Her handheld terminal emitted a soft rejection tone. Insufficient funds. Derek stared at the screen, as though the machine had insulted his bloodline. He demanded that she run the card again. She did. The same message appeared. Passengers nearby began to glance over. Sylvia hissed at him to stop making a spectacle, but her own card failed when she tried to pay. Fiona opened her banking application and discovered that every business account carried a fraud restriction. The confidence drained from all three faces at once. I sent a final notice to their private travel service. The return reservations and Sydney hotel suites had been booked through a Kensington corporate account that the board had just frozen. The agency canceled the unpaid arrangements and released the rooms. A separate alert confirmed that the chauffeured vehicle waiting in Sydney had also been withdrawn. Derek still believed he had hidden cash in Australia, but every comfortable bridge between the airport and those reserves had vanished. Cameron asked what would happen to the legitimate assets after the investigation. I told him a court would decide. Creditors would be paid, victims would be compensated, lawful beneficiaries would be protected, and anything untouched by the fraud would remain where it belonged. My purpose was not to enrich us. It was to prevent Sylvia and Derek from using inherited money to run, intimidate witnesses, or rewrite the story. On the plane, Derek finally understood the difference between owning wealth and controlling it. The trust documents might still list his name, but the money could no longer answer his commands. Sylvia's social status could not buy a glass of champagne. Fiona's collection of companies could not pay an airline charge. Their legitimate fortune had not vanished into my pocket. It had been frozen behind rules they had spent years believing applied only to other people. I closed the trust dashboard and preserved every notice in the evidence vault. 3 separate account summaries now showed 0 available funds. The charitable grants had cleared, the disputed assets were locked, and the syndicate's money remained untouched in the recovery account. Derek had entered the flight, believing Australia represented a new beginning. Before he had crossed the Pacific, he no longer had a hotel, a return ticket, a working credit line, or immediate access to the family wealth that had protected him all his life. The last restriction notice cleared, and the garage fell silent again. On one monitor, the corporate board, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and the Internal Revenue Service delivery receipts remained green. On another, the legitimate family accounts showed 0 available balances, the overdue charitable grants were complete, and the disputed assets were locked for review. Cameron stared at the screens with a mixture of profound relief and quiet devastation. The man who had been lying in a medically induced coma just hours ago was now sitting in a freezing warehouse, watching his bloodline be dismantled by its own records. He did not say a word, but the slight relaxation in his bruised shoulders told me he understood the difference between revenge and containment. The money had not become ours. It had simply stopped obeying the people who had weaponized it. I reached for my cold cup of coffee, finally allowing myself to take a slow, deep breath. Before the rim of the ceramic cup could even touch my lips, the primary diagnostic monitor on my far right flared with a blinding, aggressive crimson light. A high-pitched proximity warning alarm began to blare from the computer speakers, shattering the quiet relief we had just settled into. Cameron jumped in his seat, his hand flying to his injured ribs as he gasped and asked what was happening. I slammed my coffee cup down, spilling brown liquid across the metal desk, and pulled my keyboard close. I told him someone was actively pinging the ghost account where I had parked the $80 million. This was not a federal investigator or a corporate compliance officer. The digital footprint was entirely wrong for a legitimate government agency. The incoming traffic was raw, brutal, and incredibly sophisticated. It was bypassing the standard internet protocols, bouncing through dozens of decentralized, unregulated network nodes across Eastern Europe and Southeast Asia. I watched the malicious code attempt to tear through the outer shell of my security encryption. I did not try to fight the intrusion. I let the automated defense protocols handle the brute force attacks, while I manually traced the origin of the digital assault. I realized exactly what was happening in real time. When I intercepted the massive fortune Derek had stolen, I had embedded the complete digital dossier of his crimes directly into the transaction metadata. I wanted the Shadow Syndicate to know exactly who had taken their money and who had tried to frame my husband for the theft. Now the ruthless leaders of that international syndicate had received the message loud and clear. They had opened the digital dossier, reviewed the IP addresses, and realized they had been played for absolute fools by Derek Kensington. They were no longer looking for the naive younger brother who supposedly died in a tragic car crash in Chicago. They were turning their full, terrifying attention toward the arrogant golden child. I pulled up a specialized decryption software program I had designed specifically for monitoring illicit network traffic on the dark web. I needed to see exactly how the syndicate was reacting to the revelation. The highly encrypted packets of dark web communication began to unscramble on my screen, rapidly translating raw data into a terrifying reality. I watched a series of rapid, coordinated messages bouncing between a central server node and a localized network base operating out of Australia. The communications were cold, precise, and entirely devoid of any human emotion. They were purely logistical updates, shifting lethal resources and personnel in real time across the globe. The syndicate was officially calling off the local cleaners they had previously sent to the Chicago hospital to eliminate us. They finally realized Cameron was a dead end and a complete waste of their time. The new directives were routing straight to their international associates currently stationed across the Pacific Ocean. I watched the operational commands translate into plain English on my glowing monitor. The Australian fixers were being mobilized immediately. They were provided with the exact flight number, the commercial airline carrier, and the precise arrival time for the luxury flight Derek, Sylvia, and Fiona were currently trapped on. The syndicate associates were no longer waiting patiently in the shadows of the criminal underworld. They were receiving direct, explicit orders to bypass standard airport security channels and position themselves directly at the international arrival gate at the Sydney airport. They were going to greet the Kensington family the absolute second they stepped off the commercial plane. I turned away from the glowing red monitor and looked deeply at my husband. Cameron was watching the decrypted messages scroll rapidly across the screen, his face completely devoid of color. The dark reality of the situation was settling over him like a heavy, suffocating blanket. He knew exactly what those tactical communications meant for his relatives. The Shadow Syndicate did not arrest people who stole from them. They did not file civil lawsuits or negotiate lucrative corporate settlements. They simply eliminated human liabilities with brutal, untraceable efficiency. Cameron swallowed hard, his voice barely a rough, trembling whisper in the quiet, concrete garage. He said the syndicate fixers were going to be waiting right at the arrival gate. He said Derek and his mother were going to walk off that plane, expecting to begin a brand new life of wealth, of weapons, and instead, they were going to be quietly ushered into a waiting vehicle, never to be seen or heard from again. I watched the profound moral conflict raging in his tired eyes. These were the exact same people who had callously abandoned him in a sterile hospital bed to take the fall for their crimes. These were the people who had actively tried to murder him simply to cover up their own staggering financial mismanagement. They had deliberately forged medical documents to leave me bankrupt, imprisoned, and completely destroyed. They deserved absolutely no mercy from either of us. They were still his mother and his older brother. The primal, biological bond of family, no matter how profoundly toxic, manipulative, and broken it might be, is incredibly difficult to sever completely without feeling a deep sense of loss. He looked at me, a silent, agonizing question burning in his dark eyes. He was not asking me to forgive the people who had betrayed him. He was not asking me to let them get away with what they had done to us. He was simply confronting the horrific, unavoidable reality that his family was about to be executed in a foreign country, and we were the only two people on Earth who knew it was about to happen. I stood up from my leather chair, walking around the heavy metal desk, to stand directly in front of him. I looked into the eyes of the man I loved. I felt a surge of cold, unwavering clarity. I told Cameron that the syndicate was going to kill his family when they landed. But I shook my head, my voice firm and resolute. I told him that letting the syndicate handle this was far too easy. I wanted to tear their flawless image down to the studs. I want them to face absolute public justice. I turned back to the monitors and opened an encrypted terminal window. Cameron watched me type, his shock giving way to determination. He pulled his chair closer, ignoring the pain in his ribs, and nodded. He told me to do it. He was done protecting people who never protected him. I accessed the firm's internal calendar, navigating past the firewalls I had already compromised. I knew a financial disaster would trigger an immediate response. Sylvia had sent her lying emails an hour ago. I scanned the schedule and found exactly what I was looking for. An emergency board meeting had been convened in the primary conference room of the Chicago headquarters. The meeting was currently in progress, having started 12 minutes ago. I explained to Cameron that the board used a sophisticated video conferencing system for their executive meetings. It allowed partners to dial in and have their audio projected onto the digital display wall. I pulled up the network routing protocols for that specific room. I told him Derek had dialed into this meeting using his in-flight connection. He was positioning himself as the valiant hero, saving the company, unaware his stolen fortune was gone and the syndicate was waiting for him in Sydney. I ran a bypass script, slipping silently into the audio feed without triggering participant alerts. I routed the live audio through the speakers on my desk. The sound of the boardroom filled the garage. I could hear the murmur of executives shifting in their chairs. Then Derek's voice echoed through the speakers, dripping with manufactured sorrow. He told the board his heart was broken. He spun a tragic tale about how he had suspected his younger brother of budget discrepancies for months, but never wanted to believe flesh and blood was capable of such corporate theft. He claimed Cameron had become addicted to underground gambling and orchestrated the $80 million embezzlement to pay off debts to dangerous people. Derek assured the board that he and his mother were en route to Australia to personally secure the remaining assets before Cameron could drain those accounts. I looked at Cameron. He was staring at the speakers, his hands clenched into tight fists. Hearing his brother casually destroy his reputation with effortless lies was a profound kind of psychological violence. Sylvia's voice chimed in next over the airplane connection. She played the role of the devastated matriarch perfectly. She told the shareholders they had tried to get Cameron psychological help, but he had grown violent and paranoid. She claimed the horrific car accident was a desperate, botched attempt by Cameron to fake his own death and flee the country with the stolen funds. She implored the board to trust Derek to guide the company through this crisis, calling her eldest son the only reliable pillar left. The chairman of the board, a stern man named Harrison, formally thanked Derek for his swift action and asked how quickly they could begin cooperating with federal authorities to freeze Cameron's domestic assets. They were completely buying the lie. They were ready to hand Derek the absolute keys to the kingdom. I reached up and adjusted the webcam on my monitor. I angled the lens so it captured me sitting in the leather chair, with Cameron standing directly behind my right shoulder. The bruises on his face and the obvious pain in his posture made him look like a man who had crawled out of the grave. I told him to look straight into the camera lens and let them see exactly what a murdered man looks like. I routed my connection into the Chicago boardroom's main server. I executed a hard override command, seizing administrative control of their presentation system. In the Chicago boardroom, the quarterly financial projections currently displayed on the massive digital wall instantly vanished. The screen went pitch black for one terrifying second before snapping back to life. My face and Cameron's bruised living face right behind me suddenly towered 20 feet high in the center of the executive boardroom. I activated my microphone, ensuring my voice would boom through their surround sound system. "Good evening, gentlemen," I said, my voice echoing clearly through the concrete garage and the Chicago headquarters simultaneously. I apologize for the sudden interruption, but I felt this emergency board meeting was missing a crucial perspective. Namely, the perspective of the man you are currently accusing of international corporate treason. Absolute, stunned silence fell over the audio feed. I could hear papers dropping to the table and chairs squeaking as executives recoiled in shock. Harrison, the board chairman, let out a loud gasp, stammering Cameron's name in utter disbelief. On the airplane connection, I heard a sharp, panicked intake of breath. Derek's voice cracked over the line, high and frantic. He demanded to know what was happening, screaming at the board members to cut the video feed immediately, claiming the broadcast was a deep fake or a pre-recorded manipulation. He was losing his mind, his perfect facade crumbling into pure terror. I did not give the board members time to process the shock. I told them Derek Kensington was currently sitting in a first-class cabin flying towards Sydney, believing he had successfully stolen $80 million from a shadow syndicate. I explained that Derek used Cameron's secure credentials to launder the money, and when Cameron discovered the truth, Derek decided to permanently silence him. Derek was screaming over the audio feed now, begging the board not to listen to the delusional ravings of a low-level accountant. He commanded Harrison to terminate the connection, threatening to fire everyone if they entertained my lies for another second. I silenced Derek's audio channel with a single keystroke, cutting his frantic screaming off mid-sentence. The sudden quiet in the boardroom was deafening. I looked directly into the camera, addressing the stunned shareholders. I told them I did not expect them to take my word for it. As a forensic auditor, I only deal in indisputable evidence. I opened an audio file I had recovered from the deepest, heavily encrypted sector of Derek's personal hard drive during my 6-month infiltration. Derek was incredibly arrogant, but he was also deeply paranoid. He recorded his own phone calls to use as leverage against his associates, never imagining someone could breach his vault and use his paranoia against him. I routed the recovered audio file directly into the boardroom speakers and hit play. The static hum of a recorded call filled the room. Then Derek's unmistakable, arrogant voice echoed through the headquarters. He was speaking to a man he referred to as the mechanic. The conversation was chilling. The board members listened in horrified silence as Derek offered the mechanic $50,000 in cryptocurrency to sever the brake lines on Cameron's vehicle. Derek calmly explained his brother's daily commuting route. noting the steep concrete embankment near the highway overpass. He stated that the crash needed to look like a consequence of reckless speeding, and that Cameron could not survive the impact because a dead man cannot testify about an $80 million corporate embezzlement scheme. The recording ended with the sharp click of the phone hanging up. I let the silence hang in the air for 5 seconds, allowing the sheer, unfiltered reality of Derek's murderous plot to sink into the minds of every single executive sitting in that room. The Golden Child narrative was officially dead. The recorded call ended, and the boardroom remained silent long enough for Derek to believe the connection had failed. Then Harrison's voice returned, no longer courteous and no longer uncertain. He asked the corporate secretary to confirm that the meeting still had a quorum. A series of shaken voices answered yes. Harrison instructed outside counsel to place an emergency resolution on the screen, immediate removal of Derek and Sylvia from every executive position, suspension of their voting authority, cancellation of their corporate access, and referral of all evidence to federal prosecutors. Derek's muted channel flashed as he tried repeatedly to break back into the meeting. I restored his audio only after the secretary began calling the vote. He exploded into the speakers, ordering Harrison to stop. He threatened lawsuits, firings, and personal ruin. Harrison calmly reminded him that a director accused of attempted murder and international embezzlement did not possess the authority to fire the board investigating him. One vote after another sounded through the conference system. Yes, yes, yes. The resolution passed unanimously. The corporate secretary announced that Derek's title as chief executive officer was terminated, effective immediately. Sylvia was removed as chairwoman emeritus and stripped of every committee appointment. Their company credit cards, aircraft privileges, expense accounts, and voting proxies were canceled. Because they had pledged portions of their family holdings against corporate obligations, the board also authorized outside counsel to seek a freeze on their equity pending the fraud investigation. Cameron closed his eyes as the decision became official. The company that had always chosen Derek over him had finally heard the truth. I expected relief, but what crossed his face was quieter and more complicated. Justice did not erase the fact that his brother had tried to kill him, or that his mother had helped frame him. It merely stopped them from doing more damage. On the airplane, the consequences arrived all at once. Derek's tablet vibrated against the tray table, even though I had locked most of its functions. A narrow notification banner appeared, pushed through by the airline's messaging system. Termination of executive authority. He read it twice, then a third time. A second message followed from the family office, stating that his access credentials had been revoked. A third informed Sylvia that the board had removed her and frozen all discretionary payments. Sylvia snatched the tablet from Derek's hands. Her eyes moved rapidly across the notices. For several seconds, she made no sound. Then she turned toward her golden child with a look so violent that even Fiona recoiled. "You promised this was contained," Sylvia said. Derek told her the board had been manipulated by a criminal intrusion. He insisted he could reverse the vote as soon as they landed. Sylvia slapped the tablet down onto his tray and demanded to know how Whitney had obtained the mechanic's recording. Derek answered too slowly. The hesitation told his mother everything. "You recorded that call," she whispered. "You kept evidence of your own crime." He defended himself by saying he recorded everyone. He claimed it was leverage, a precaution, a standard protection in their world. Sylvia's voice rose until passengers several rows away turned in their seats. She called him incompetent. She said she had spent 30 years protecting the Kensington name, only to watch him destroy it in a single night. She blamed him for the missing money, the frozen trusts, the canceled hotel, and the federal investigation. Every sentence erased another layer of the perfect family facade. Derek's fear turned into rage. He reminded Sylvia that she had approved the forged resolutions, the false debt transfers, and the decision to leave Cameron in the hospital. He said she had insisted Whitney be buried under the medical bills because a grieving wife made a believable scapegoat. Sylvia denied it loudly, forgetting that half the cabin could hear her. She claimed she had only followed Derek's financial advice and knew nothing about the brake lines. Fiona stared from one to the other, finally understanding that neither of them intended to protect her. She pulled her phone close and began typing a message to a lawyer in Chicago. Derek noticed and demanded to know what she was doing. Fiona lifted her chin and said she was requesting separate counsel. Then, in a voice loud enough for Sylvia and the nearby passengers to hear, she told Derek their marriage was over. The words struck him harder than the board vote. He grabbed Fiona's wrist and ordered her to delete the message. She yanked away, knocking her untouched champagne across his shirt. She said she would cooperate with investigators, surrender every account record she possessed, and testify about the conversations she had heard at the Kensington estate. Derek called her an ungrateful parasite who had spent his money for years. Fiona shouted that it was never his money, it belonged to the company, the syndicate, or anyone else he had stolen from. Sylvia lunged across the aisle and told Fiona she would receive nothing from the family. Fiona laughed bitterly and pointed out that the family had nothing left to give. The insult shattered Sylvia's remaining control. She reached for Fiona's phone. Fiona pulled back. Derek rose from his seat despite the illuminated seatbelt sign and tried to seize the device himself. A flight attendant hurried down the aisle and ordered him to sit. Derek ignored her. He leaned over Fiona, one hand clamped around the seat back, the other reaching for the phone that could connect her to independent counsel. Fiona screamed. Several passengers stood unsure whether to intervene. The cabin supervisor arrived with a second attendant and warned Derek that failure to comply would be treated as an in-flight security incident. Derek spun toward them, his face twisted with humiliation. He shouted that he owned the airline's largest corporate travel account and could have them dismissed. The supervisor looked at her handheld terminal and said the account had been suspended. A ripple of nervous laughter moved through the cabin. Derek heard it. His expression changed from fury to something reckless. He shoved the tray table aside and tried to step into the aisle. The cabin supervisor moved first. She blocked his path while the second attendant called for assistance. A broad-shouldered, off-duty air marshal seated several rows behind them identified himself and approached. Derek struggled when the marshal took his arm. The movement sent the champagne glass crashing to the floor. Sylvia screamed at everyone to stop humiliating her son. Fiona pressed herself against the window, clutching her phone to her chest. Within seconds, Derek was forced back into his seat. The marshal secured one wrist with a soft restraint approved for disruptive passengers and fastened the other to the fixed frame beside the armrest. The cabin supervisor informed him that the restraint would remain until the aircraft reached the gate and local authorities decided what to do. Derek demanded his lawyers. The supervisor told him he could make requests after landing. Sylvia sank into her seat, breathing hard. Her hair had fallen loose, and one sleeve of her immaculate blouse was stained with champagne. She looked at Derek as though he were a stranger. He looked back with naked hatred. Fiona kept typing, sending copies of her messages and account records to the attorney before anyone could take the phone. A final notification appeared on all 3 devices. It came from the board chairman. All corporate authority revoked. Evidence referred to the FBI. Do not contact company personnel. The captain's voice entered the cabin, announcing that the aircraft would begin its descent into Sydney in approximately 30 minutes. The seatbelt sign chimed. Outside the windows, the black Pacific slowly gave way to the first pale line of morning. Inside first class, no one spoke. The Kensington family had boarded the flight as a united dynasty, escaping consequence. They were approaching Australia, bankrupt, divided, publicly exposed, and unable to trust the person sitting beside them. Cameron stared at me, the harsh blue light of the monitors, casting long shadows across his bruised face. I could see the internal struggle behind his eyes, a desperate tug of war between the instinct for survival and the ghosts of family loyalty. Letting the international syndicate eliminate Derek and Sylvia in the dark alleys of Sydney would solve all of our immediate problems. It would be entirely untraceable to us. A silent, violent end to a profoundly toxic bloodline. But a silent end meant they would be remembered back in Chicago as tragic victims of a mysterious overseas crime. Their high society friends would mourn them. The corporate world would eulogize Derek as a brilliant financial mind taken too soon. Sylvia would be remembered as a devoted matriarch who suffered a terrible fate. I told Cameron I refused to let them die as martyrs or victims of circumstance. They had built their entire existence on a meticulously crafted illusion of superiority, looking down on people like me while secretly wallowing in criminal filth. I wanted the world to see the dirt under their polished fingernails. I wanted every single person who had ever attended one of Sylvia's lavish charity galas or praised Derek's business acumen to watch them be dragged away in federal handcuffs. Cameron took a slow, painful breath, wincing as his broken ribs shifted under his dark sweatshirt. He looked at the encrypted messages still scrolling across my secondary screen, detailing the lethal preparations currently underway in Australia. He turned his gaze back to me, the hesitation melting away from his expression, replaced by a cold, hardened resolve. He told me to make the call. He wanted the entire world to know exactly who they were and what they had done. I turned back to my master laptop, my fingers hovering over the keys as I prepared to assemble the most devastating prosecution file the federal government had ever received. This was not going to be an anonymous tip or a vague suggestion of corporate impropriety. I was a senior forensic auditor, and I was about to deliver a fully prosecuted case wrapped in a digital bow. I started by isolating the massive data dump I had already sent to the corporate board of directors and the domestic financial regulatory agencies. That file contained the irrefutable proof of the $80 million embezzlement, the offshore shell companies, and the money laundering pathways. But federal authorities needed more than just financial ledgers to justify an immediate international intervention. They needed evidence of imminent, catastrophic harm. They needed the physical crimes. I pulled up the forged medical documents Sylvia had dropped onto Cameron's chest just a few hours ago. I had scanned them into my secure server the moment we arrived at the garage. I highlighted the fraudulent digital signatures, the manipulated notary stamps, and the aggressive transfer of Cameron's catastrophic medical debt exclusively into my name. It established a clear, undeniable motive for their sudden flight out of the country. Then I dug into the darkest corner of my digital vault. I retrieved the recovered audio file where Derek explicitly offered a mechanic $50,000 in cryptocurrency to sever the brake lines on Cameron's car. I isolated the exact timestamps, enhanced the audio clarity, and bundled it with the GPS tracking data from Derek's phone on the day of the crash. It was absolute, incontrovertible proof of premeditated, attempted murder. I packaged the entire collection of evidence into a single, heavily encrypted digital vault. Now I needed to make sure it landed in the hands of someone who could act with international authority in a matter of hours. I bypassed standard reporting channels and accessed the direct secure communication portals for the Federal Bureau of Investigation's White-Collar Crime Division in Chicago. I drafted a concise, highly detailed summary of the situation, outlining the financial fraud, the attempted murder, and the immediate flight risk of the primary suspects. I attached the encrypted vault and provided the decryption key. But contacting domestic authorities was only half the battle. Derek and Sylvia were currently flying over the Pacific Ocean, completely outside the physical jurisdiction of American law enforcement. I needed the authorities waiting on the ground when the plane touched the tarmac. I opened a secure international communication channel directly to the Australian Federal Police. The Australian authorities took financial crimes and international syndicates incredibly seriously. I knew an incoming tip regarding $80 million in cartel money and a fleeing American executive would trigger an absolute massive response. I wrote a localized message to the Australian Command Center detailing the specific threat. I explained that the individuals arriving on commercial flight 881 were not just fleeing domestic prosecution, but were actively being targeted by local syndicate operatives waiting at the airport. I warned them that if the Australian police did not intercept these passengers immediately upon arrival, there would be a highly public, violent execution right in the middle of their international baggage claim. I stressed that the safety of countless innocent bystanders in the airport terminal completely depended on their swift, decisive action to secure the targets before the syndicate could strike. To ensure the authorities knew exactly who they were dealing with, I accessed the commercial airline's internal passenger manifest. I pulled the specific seating chart for the luxury first-class cabin. I noted the exact seat numbers for Derek, Sylvia, and Fiona. I downloaded their passport photos, their secure boarding pass information, and their detailed physical descriptions. I attached all of this logistical data to my urgent communication to the Australian Federal Police. I wanted to eliminate any possibility of confusion or delay when the aircraft doors finally opened. The authorities would not have to search the crowded terminal or guess which wealthy American tourists were the international fugitives. They would have a precise, targeted map leading straight to their seats. I reviewed the complete transmission package one final time, ensuring every single document, audio file, and tracking log was perfectly aligned. I hit the send command, watching the massive data files launch through the secure federal portals. The delivery confirmations popped up on my screen in rapid succession. The Federal Bureau of Investigation headquarters in downtown Chicago had officially received the massive file. The Australian Federal Police headquarters in Sydney had successfully acknowledged the high-priority transmission. The massive international trap was officially set, and the jaws were locking into place. I leaned back in my chair, the adrenaline slowly giving way to a profound sense of accomplishment. I looked slowly over at Cameron. He was staring at the flight tracker application I had pulled up on a side monitor. The small digital airplane icon was inching closer and closer to the Australian coastline. We had less than 30 minutes before the massive commercial flight was scheduled to reach the gate. Cameron swallowed hard, his voice quiet but incredibly steady in the cool air of the garage. He said the highly trained syndicate fixers were probably already circling the massive airport terminal, checking their weapons, and waiting for his mother and his brother to confidently walk right into the crowded arrivals hall. I turned my chair to face him, a cold, deeply satisfied smile slowly spreading across my face. I reached out and gently rested my steady hand over his. "The syndicate is waiting at baggage claim," I told Cameron. "But the feds are already waiting at the jet bridge." The massive commercial aircraft carrying the Kensington family began its final descent through the thick cloud cover over the Australian coastline. Inside the luxurious first-class cabin, the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense. The 15-hour flight across the Pacific Ocean had been a psychological torture chamber for Derek. He had spent the majority of the journey staring blankly at the seatback screen in front of him, his mind desperately calculating and recalculating his options. The digital blackout I had engineered had left him entirely blind, but his natural arrogance was slowly trying to convince him that the situation was still salvageable. He reasoned with himself that, even if I had compromised his primary digital accounts, he still had physical contingencies in place. He had secured a series of private safety deposit boxes in a high-end Sydney banking facility years ago, stuffing them with untraceable bearer bonds, stacks of foreign currency, and emergency identity documents. He firmly believed that if he could just get off this plane and disappear into the sprawling metropolis before the Shadow Syndicate realized he had touched down, he could still pull off a magnificent escape. Beside him, Sylvia was meticulously applying a fresh layer of expensive powder to her face, using a gold-plated compact mirror. She refused to look disheveled when she stepped onto foreign soil. Despite the spectacular collapse of her corporate narrative and the terrifying reality of their financial exposure, she still clung to the deeply ingrained belief that her wealth and status made her untouchable by ordinary consequences. She smoothed the wrinkles from her silk blouse, her movements sharp and agitated. She leaned over and whispered sharply to Derek, instructing him to stop looking like a terrified animal. She told him they needed to walk through the airport with absolute confidence, grab a private car, and head straight to the banking district to access his physical reserves. She insisted that once they had cash in hand, they could hire the best international defense attorneys money could buy and crush whatever pathetic legal case a low-level auditor was trying to build against them from a dirty garage in Chicago. Fiona sat quietly across the aisle, clutching her designer handbag against her chest like a protective shield. She had barely spoken a word since her vanity business accounts had been liquidated to zero. The realization that her lavish lifestyle was entirely funded by stolen money and was now completely gone had left her in a state of catatonic shock. She was no longer pretending to be a willing participant in the escape. During the final descent, she had already demanded separate counsel and announced that the marriage was over. Now she clutched the messages she had sent to her lawyer, silently rehearsing how quickly she would offer investigators every record she possessed. The heavy wheels of the aircraft finally hit the tarmac with a loud, reverberating thud. The engines roared as the plane rapidly decelerated, pressing the passengers forward against their seatbelts. The agonizing wait for the aircraft to taxi to the terminal felt like another lifetime. After the aircraft reached the gate, the cabin supervisor removed Derek's soft restraint under the watch of 2 crew members. The moment the glowing seatbelt sign chimed off, he practically leaped out of his luxurious reclining seat. He yanked open the overhead storage bin with unnecessary force, pulling down their matching leather carry-on bags. He shoved one toward Fiona and handed the other to his mother, his movements frantic and uncoordinated. He muttered under his breath that they needed to move quickly and not make eye contact with anyone. He wanted to be the very first people off the plane, desperate to put as much distance as possible between himself and the aircraft cabin that had served as his digital prison. The heavy cabin door swung open, allowing the warm, humid air of the Australian morning to flood into the aircraft. Derek led the charge down the jet bridge, his long legs eating up the distance. Sylvia followed closely on his heels, her chin held high, projecting a false air of aristocratic annoyance at having been confined for so long. Fiona trailed behind them, keeping her head down, her steps heavy with impending dread. They merged into the steady stream of arriving international passengers, making the long, winding trek toward the massive immigration and customs hall. The sterile, brightly lit corridors of the Sydney airport felt vast and intimidating. Derek kept his eyes fixed firmly straight ahead, silently rehearsing the confident, wealthy businessman persona he planned to project for the border agents. He was entirely convinced that his expensive suit and American passport would ensure a smooth, unquestioned entry into the country. They reached the sprawling customs hall, joining the shortest line available for foreign passport holders. The queue moved with agonizing slowness. Every minute they stood shuffling forward felt like a ticking clock in Derek's mind. He continually checked his wristwatch, his anxiety mounting as he calculated how long it would take to navigate through baggage claim, locate a private transport vehicle, and reach the sanctuary of his secure banking facility in the city center. He looked around the massive hall, scanning the crowds for anyone who looked out of place, completely unaware that his true threat was not hiding in the shadows, but waiting patiently right at the official checkpoints. Finally, it was their turn. Derek stepped up to the elevated customs counter, flashing a brilliant, completely manufactured smile at the uniformed Australian border agent behind the thick glass. Sylvia and Fiona stood directly behind him, maintaining their rigid posture. Derek confidently handed over his dark blue American passport, followed immediately by his mother's and his wife's documents. He greeted the agent with forced casualness, stating they were visiting Sydney for an extended family vacation and looking forward to exploring the beautiful coastline. He leaned casually against the counter, exuding the comfortable entitlement of a man who believed the rules did not apply to him. The customs agent did not return the smile. He took the 3 passports with a blank, professional expression and swiped the first one Derek's through the digital scanning reader built into his keyboard. He did not look up, his eyes fixed intently on the glowing monitor recessed into his desk. For a fraction of a second, the terminal around them seemed to fall perfectly silent. Then the digital scanner let out a sharp, descending electronic tone. The border agent's computer monitor instantly flashed a brilliant, blinding red. The color reflected off the glass partition, casting a crimson glow across Derek's pale, sweating face. The agent stopped typing immediately. His hands hovered over the keyboard as he read the high-priority security alerts cascading down his screen. The passports had not just been flagged for a routine secondary screening. They had been locked down by a direct international mandate from Interpol, correlating with an urgent, maximum priority warrant issued by the Federal Bureau of Investigation and coordinated with the highest levels of the Australian Federal Police. Derek saw the red glow reflecting on the glass and felt the remaining oxygen leave his lungs. The manufactured smile melted off his face, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated panic. He realized, in a terrifying instant, that the digital blockade I had built did not just trap him on the airplane. It had beaten him to the ground. He lunged forward, his hand slapping against the glass partition, demanding that the agent return his passports immediately, claiming there had been a massive administrative error that his corporate lawyers would sort out. Sylvia stepped forward, her voice rising in shrill indignation, demanding to speak to a supervisor and threatening international legal action against the airport authority for harassing American executives. She commanded Derek to grab the documents so they could leave the terminal. But before Derek could even attempt to pull his hand back from the glass, the atmosphere in the cavernous immigration hall shifted violently. The heavy thud of tactical combat boots echoed sharply against the polished tile floor. Derek whipped his head around, intending to grab his mother and run blindly toward the exit. He froze completely. Bursting from the restricted security doors on both sides of the customs counter were dozens of heavily armed tactical officers from the Australian Federal Police. They moved with terrifying coordinated speed, their dark uniforms and tactical vests forming a solid, impenetrable wall of authority. Before the Kensington family could take a single step backward, the officers had completely sealed every single exit in the terminal, cutting off their escape and trapping them exactly where I wanted them. The tactical officers sealed the terminal before Derek could move. Passengers backed away from the customs area, dragging suitcases and children with them as the dark uniforms formed a barrier around the Kensington family. Derek's mind searched frantically for an exit, but every corridor ended in armed authority. The syndicate might be waiting beyond baggage claim, yet the police had reached him first. His phone vibrated inside his jacket. The sound was absurdly ordinary in the middle of the lockdown. Derek flinched and looked down. The airport network had automatically connected the moment he entered the immigration hall, restoring just enough service for an incoming video call. My name filled the screen. Whitney. For 1 second he seemed afraid to answer, then desperation defeated pride. He pulled the phone out with shaking fingers and accepted the call. My face appeared against the clean, dark background of the garage command center. I had changed out of the soaked hospital clothes and put on the spare black jacket I kept near the servers. Cameron stood beside me, pale but upright, one hand resting on the back of my chair. He was alive, conscious, and watching his brother confront the consequences of trying to murder him. Derek held the phone so close that his breath fogged the glass. He demanded to know what I had done to the passports. His voice was no longer the smooth, superior voice from the hospital. It cracked around every word. I told him I had not touched the passports. The FBI, Interpol, and the Australian authorities had acted after receiving evidence of international fraud, flight risk, and attempted murder. I had merely made certain the evidence arrived before he did. Behind him, Sylvia demanded to see the screen. She tried to seize the phone, but Derek turned away from her. Fiona stood several feet back, staring at Cameron's image with stunned relief and terror. The border agent remained behind the glass, silently watching the tactical team close in. Derek lowered his voice. He said we could still solve the situation privately. He claimed the board had overreacted and the money could be restored once we stopped attacking each other. I let him finish. Then I told him the $80 million had already been returned to a locked recovery channel and released back to the syndicate under federal observation. They knew exactly who had taken it. They had Derek's device records, Sylvia's network address, and every forged authorization used to frame Cameron. His eyes shifted toward the arrivals gate. Through the glass, 3 men in dark suits stood motionless beside the baggage carousels. Derek recognized them. The remaining color left his face. I told him they were no longer waiting for us. Their money was back. Their dossier identified him as the thief. The only thing separating him from those men was the line of Australian officers preparing to arrest him. He swallowed and asked what I wanted. The question almost made me laugh. For years, the Kensington family had assumed every human action was a negotiation over money or status. I told him I did not want a payment, a title, a seat on the board, or an apology purchased under pressure. I wanted the truth recorded in court, where Sylvia's friends, the shareholders, the employees, and every person they had intimidated could hear it. Derek glanced at the tactical officers and began bargaining faster. He offered me hidden assets in Sydney. He said there were bearer bonds in a private banking facility, emergency cash, and documents that could disappear forever if he was arrested. I told him the banking facility had already received a preservation notice. The boxes would be opened under warrant, not by him. He offered control of the remaining Kensington companies. I told him the board had terminated him and frozen his equity. He offered the family estate. I told him it was tied to the same guarantees that secured the fraudulent expansion debt. He promised to pay every medical bill and restore our home. I reminded him that those bills had been forged into my name while Cameron lay helpless in a hospital bed. Every offer collapsed before it left his mouth. Sylvia finally tore the phone from his hand. Her face filled the screen, makeup immaculate, but eyes wild. She ordered me to call off the police. She said the Kensington family could make me unimaginably wealthy if I stopped this humiliation. I asked her whether that was the same family that had told me to play the grieving widow until the bank threw me into the street. Her expression tightened. She changed tactics instantly, claiming she had been misled by Derek and had never wanted Cameron hurt. Cameron stepped closer to the camera. Sylvia saw him clearly for the first time since abandoning him. She whispered his name, as if a soft voice could erase what she had done. Cameron asked why she had placed forged debt on his chest, without checking whether he could hear her. Sylvia said she had been frightened. He asked why fear had made her protect Derek instead of her injured son. She had no answer. Derek snatched the phone back. He stared at Cameron and said they were brothers, that whatever had happened could be repaired. Cameron's hand tightened on the chair. He told Derek brothers did not pay mechanics to cut each other's brake lines. Derek denied the recording, then stopped when he saw from our expressions that denial was useless. His shoulders collapsed. At last he looked directly at me, rather than through me. He admitted that he had underestimated me. He said he had believed I was an obedient accountant with no access, no influence, and no courage to fight the Kensington name. His voice dropped to a whisper. He asked me to tell the officers there had been a misunderstanding. He begged me to create another file, alter the evidence, or give him enough time to reach a lawyer. I told him the woman he had dismissed as a bean counter had preserved the evidence precisely so no one, including me, could alter it. The chain of custody was locked. The files were in federal hands. His own signatures, voice, and device certificates would speak for him now. Then I listed what remained of his escape plan. His offshore balance was zero. His trust distributions were frozen. His company cards were canceled. The Sydney hotel had released his suite. The return flight had been voided. The private car had been withdrawn. His safety deposit facility was under preservation order. He had no corporate title, no usable credit, no secure destination, and no person on the ground willing to protect him. Derek looked around the terminal as though each fact had removed another wall from an invisible shelter. Sylvia began crying behind him. Fiona turned away, already distancing herself from both of them. He asked whether I had planned all of this from the beginning. I told him no. He had planned it when he decided Cameron's life was worth less than $80 million. Sylvia had planned it when she transferred forged debts to me and boarded a plane. I had only followed the evidence to the ending they created. The lead tactical officer raised one hand, signaling his team to advance. Derek saw the motion and pressed the phone close again. He begged one final time. He said he would confess, testify against the syndicate, surrender everything, and spend the rest of his life making amends if I could prevent the arrest from becoming public. That request revealed what he truly feared. Not prison, not the murder charge. Exposure. I looked at Cameron. He gave a small, steady nod. I told Derek the public part was no longer negotiable. Hundreds of passengers were watching the warrants were active, and the cameras were already recording. The Kensington name would not shield him again. His mouth opened, but I ended the call before another excuse could emerge. The screen went black in his hand. He stood in the center of the bright immigration hall with nothing left but his reflection on the glass. From the garage, Cameron and I watched through the airport security feed as the officers closed the final distance. Derek slowly lowered the useless phone. Sylvia clutched her handbag against her chest. Fiona raised both hands before anyone ordered her to do so. Then, the lead officer's command thundered across the terminal. The sharp, echoing command of the tactical officer cut through the cavernous immigration hall like a whip. He shouted for everyone to stand down and keep their hands clearly visible. Derek stood absolutely frozen, his leather shoes rooted to the polished tile floor. The blood drained rapidly from his face, his jaw hung slack, his eyes wide with a terror he had never experienced in his privileged life. The surrounding passengers immediately backed away in a panicked wave, clearing a wide, empty circle around the Kensington family. Sylvia refused to accept the reality unfolding right in front of her. Her deeply ingrained arrogance acted as a bizarre shield against the physical danger. She stepped forward, ignoring the raised weapons, and slammed her manicured hand against the customs counter. She shouted that they were wealthy American citizens being subjected to illegal harassment. She ordered the tactical officers to step aside immediately, threatening to call the American embassy to have everyone fired for detaining her family. The lead officer did not even blink at her aristocratic outrage. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a weathered face and a completely unbothered expression. He stepped directly into Sylvia's personal space, forcing her to crane her neck upward. He looked right past her and locked his cold gaze onto her golden child. He asked to confirm the identity of Derek Kensington. Derek managed a jerky, pathetic nod, his entire body trembling as the reality of his situation finally breached his denial. The lead officer reached into his tactical vest and pulled out a heavy bundle of folded federal warrants. He read the charges aloud, his voice booming across the silent terminal. He announced that Derek Sylvia and Fiona Kensington were being placed under immediate arrest pursuant to an international red notice issued by Interpol and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The charges echoed off the high ceilings for hundreds of onlookers to hear. Massive international wire fraud, aggravated corporate embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit premeditated murder. The word murder hung in the humid airport air like a physical weight. The surrounding crowd let out a collective gasp. Dozens of smartphone cameras were instantly raised into the air, the bright flashes capturing every single agonizing second of the Kensington family's destruction. The flawless, untouchable image they had spent decades cultivating was being live-streamed to the world in real time. Fiona collapsed. Her knees simply gave out beneath her and she fell hard onto the polished airport floor. She began weeping hysterically. Her perfect blowout ruined her expensive makeup running down her face in dark streaks. She screamed that she had nothing to do with any of this, begging the officers to let her go, offering to testify against her husband right then and there. Derek looked down at his sobbing wife, but he made no move to help her. He realized, with a sickening clarity, that the quiet girl he had mocked had meticulously orchestrated his absolute annihilation. Sylvia finally broke. As two tactical officers moved in to secure her wrists, she began thrashing wildly. She swung her arms, her heavy designer handbag, catching an officer on the shoulder. The brief act of resistance was a catastrophic mistake. The officers moved with swift, unforgiving efficiency. They spun Sylvia around, pushing her face down onto the hard surface of the customs desk. The pristine camel hair coat she had worn to project power was shoved aside. The sharp, metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs locking around her wrists echoed loudly in the silent hall. Sylvia screamed the sound raw and desperate. She shrieked that those handcuffs were ruining her wrists, that they were destroying her clothing, that she demanded a phone call to her private attorneys in Chicago. The officers ignored her completely. They hauled her backward, her designer shoes slipping clumsily on the tile as they forced her to stand. Derek did not fight. When the officers grabbed his arms and forced them behind his back, he simply let them. The cold steel locked tightly around his wrists, biting into his skin. An officer kicked his designer bags aside, treating them like ordinary evidence. The extravagant wealth that had defined Derek's entire existence meant absolutely nothing here. He was no longer a powerful executive preparing to buy a beachfront mansion. He was just another common criminal being processed into the global penal system. While the chaotic spectacle unfolded in the center of the customs hall, a completely different scene was taking place just beyond the frosted glass partitions of the International Arrivals Gate. 3 men, dressed in dark suits, stood near a row of empty baggage carousels. They stood with a rigid, unnatural stillness, their eyes fixed intently on the commotion happening on the other side of the glass. These were the local fixers for the Shadow Syndicate. They had arrived at the airport with specific, lethal instructions to intercept the Kensington family the exact moment they stepped past the customs checkpoint. The tallest of the 3 men reached into his jacket and pulled out an encrypted, untraceable smartphone. The screen was illuminated with a priority message that had just arrived through a dark web routing portal. The message confirmed that a secure Ghost account had just transferred $80 million back into the primary syndicate holdings. The massive debt had been paid in full, down to the absolute last penny. The message also included a brief digitally signed note from a user identifying herself only as the Bean Counter. The note stated that the stolen funds were returned and the thieves were currently being handed over to the federal government. The tall man looked up from his glowing screen. He watched through the thick glass as the heavily armed Australian police officers began marching Derek Sylvia and Fiona through the terminal. The Kensingtons were surrounded by a phalanx of dark uniforms, their heads bowed to hide their tear-stained faces from the relentless flashes of smartphone cameras. They were being paraded through the airport like prized captures, utterly stripped of their pride, their luggage, and their freedom. The syndicate fixer let out a low, approving hum. The organization cared only about two things: retrieving their money and punishing those who stole it. The quiet auditor in Chicago had managed to accomplish both tasks with terrifying surgical precision. The money was back in their control, and the Kensington family was about to spend the rest of their natural lives rotting in a federal penitentiary. The debt was settled. The tall man slipped the encrypted phone back into his jacket pocket. He gave a subtle nod to his two associates. Without exchanging a word, the three men turned away from the glass partition. They melted seamlessly into the bustling crowd of international travelers, walking calmly out the sliding glass doors of the airport. Derek Kensington stumbled forward as a police officer shoved him roughly toward the exit doors leading to the armored transport vehicles waiting on the tarmac. He craned his neck, looking desperately toward the arrivals gate, hoping to see the syndicate men he knew were supposed to be waiting for him. He saw only the backs of three men in dark suits walking away. In that terrifying second, Derek realized the crushing truth of his situation. The syndicate had received their money, and they were walking away. He was no longer a target. He was just federal property. And the brutal, unyielding threat that had shadowed Whitney and Cameron was completely, entirely gone. I closed the connection to the airport surveillance feeds, letting my monitors return to their standard diagnostic displays. The heavy silence of the industrial garage rushed back in to fill the space. I slowly turned my leather chair to look at my husband. Cameron was staring at the blank screen, his chest rising and falling in deep, shuddering breaths. The suffocating weight he had been carrying since the moment he woke up in that hospital bed had finally lifted. We sat together in the cold, concrete room and watched the international news networks pick up the story. It happened faster than I had anticipated. Within an hour, every major financial news outlet was broadcasting live footage from the Sydney airport. We watched the shaky, amateur smartphone videos captured by bystanders in the terminal. The anchors described the spectacular, unprecedented downfall of the Kensington financial empire in real time. They showed clips of Sylvia being pushed into the back of an armored police vehicle, her camel hair coat ruined, and her face shielded from the flashing cameras. They showed Derek, handcuffed and completely broken, his arrogance entirely shattered. The news networks reported that the Australian Federal Police had detained them on massive international warrants, and the extradition process back to the United States was already underway. The media coverage was relentless, completely stripping away the polished, untouchable facade the Kensington family had spent generations meticulously building. The untouchable dynasty was finally paying the ultimate price for their cruelty, and we had prime seats for the conclusion. The next morning, the federal authorities officially arrived at our secure garage. I had sent my physical location in the final encrypted data package to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, so they knew where to find us. A team of federal agents and financial regulators stepped into the industrial space, their expressions a mix of profound shock and deep professional respect when they saw my server set up. They did not treat us like suspects. They treated us like the crucial key to the largest corporate fraud case of the decade. The lead agent sat across from my metal desk and officially informed Cameron that he was cleared of all wrongdoing. The audio recording of Derek bribing the mechanic had prompted an immediate warrant for the mechanic's arrest, and the man had already confessed to cutting the brake lines on Cameron's car. The attempted murder charges against Derek were airtight. As for me, the regulators from the Securities and Exchange Commission classified my actions as corporate whistleblowing. Because my highly detailed forensic audit had directly uncovered $80 million in international money laundering and systemic corporate tax evasion, I was legally entitled to a percentage of the recovered funds under federal whistleblower protection laws. The lead regulator handed me a preliminary document outlining a guaranteed federal bounty payout of $12 million. I looked at the staggering number printed on the official government letterhead. I had spent my entire career tracking down stolen money for wealthy executives who barely knew my name. Now my skills had not only saved our lives, but they had secured our financial future with completely clean, legitimate wealth. The weeks following the arrests were a blur of physical and emotional healing. We moved out of the cold industrial garage and rented a beautiful private brownstone in a quiet Chicago neighborhood. Without the constant, terrifying threat of the Shadow Syndicate or his manipulative family hanging over us, Cameron was finally able to focus entirely on his physical recovery. He attended physical therapy sessions every single morning, pushing through the pain in his healing ribs and the weakness from his time in the medically induced coma. I stood by his side through every difficult appointment, watching the man I loved slowly rebuild his strength. But the physical healing was only half the battle. The psychological wounds inflicted by his mother and his brother were incredibly deep. Cameron had to process the grief of realizing his blood relatives had viewed his life as completely disposable. He spent hours talking through the betrayal, slowly coming to terms with the fact that his family's conditional love was a flawed reflection of their own greed, not a measure of his actual worth. 2 months after the airport ambush, we drove to a prominent family law office in downtown Chicago. Cameron sat straight and tall in a leather chair, across from a senior attorney. He did not look like the man who had slid down a hospital laundry chute. He looked healthy, clear-eyed, and incredibly resolute. The attorney slid a thick stack of legal documents across the table. These were not corporate ledgers or forged foreclosure notices. They were official name change petitions and legal severance declarations. Cameron picked up the brass pen provided by the attorney. He did not hesitate for a single second. He pressed the pen to the paper and permanently severed all ties with his toxic bloodline. He signed away any future claim to the Kensington estate, relinquishing his right to any remaining legitimate assets. He officially dropped the Kensington surname, taking my maiden name instead. When he set the pen down, a profound sense of peace seemed to settle over his shoulders. He was no longer the forgotten younger brother of a corrupt empire. He was truly his own man, completely free from the dark criminal legacy of his deeply narcissistic parents. As the spectacular criminal trials of Sylvia and Derek began to dominate the national news cycle, my professional reputation in the financial sector skyrocketed. The corporate world had learned exactly who orchestrated the data dump that brought down the Kensington firm. My personal cell phone and my professional email inbox were suddenly flooded with highly competitive, lucrative job offers. Top-tier accounting firms in New York, massive international hedge funds in London, and elite cybersecurity divisions in Silicon Valley were all desperately trying to recruit the forensic auditor who had dismantled a global money laundering syndicate from a concrete garage. They offered signing bonuses, corner offices, and executive titles that would have seemed impossible just 1 short year ago. Headhunters were leaving me voicemails begging for just 5 minutes of my time, promising that I could name my price and write my own job description. I sat at the kitchen island of our rented brownstone, scrolling through the endless stream of recruitment emails from executives. Cameron walked into the kitchen, pouring 2 cups of coffee. He set a mug down in front of me, noticing the glowing screen of my laptop. He asked me which corporation I was going to choose, assuming I was eager to get back into the traditional corporate world now that our lives had stabilized. I looked at the salary offers flashing across my screen. I thought about the executives who had previously mocked my profession, and the wealthy families who assumed people like me were just mindless cogs in their corporate machines. I reached out and gently closed the lid of my laptop. the sudden snap of the metal echoing in the quiet kitchen. I looked up at my husband, a slow, determined smile spreading across my face. I told Cameron I was not going to accept any of those job offers. I had spent too many years cleaning up the toxic messes of arrogant people in expensive suits. I told him I had a much better idea for our $12 million bounty, and it did not involve working for anyone else ever again. Cameron set his coffee mug down on the marble counter, raising his eyebrows in surprise. He leaned forward, resting his forearms against the island, and asked me what exactly I was planning to do with $12 million in federal reward money. I stood up from the kitchen stool and walked over to the large bay window overlooking the quiet Chicago street. I told him the financial world was absolutely full of men exactly like his brother. Arrogant executives who believed they were smart enough to hide their dirty money in the digital shadows, relying on outdated security systems and the willful ignorance of their boards. I turned back to face him, feeling a sudden intense surge of clarity. I proposed we build our own firm right here in the city, an elite corporate cybersecurity and forensic auditing agency. We would be the people corporations called when they suspected internal rot, when they needed someone who could tear through shell companies and offshore accounts with surgical precision. I told him I had the technical expertise to dismantle any financial labyrinth in the world, but I needed a partner who understood the operational mechanics of high-level client relations. I needed someone who could navigate the boardrooms and negotiate the contracts while I hunted down the data. Cameron looked at me, a slow, genuine smile breaking across his face for the first time in months. He did not hesitate. He walked across the kitchen, wrapped his arms around me, and told me he was completely in. The process of building our new enterprise from the ground up became our shared therapy. We threw ourselves into the intricate, disgusting logistical details, working side by side late into the night, sketching out comprehensive business plans and drawing up operational frameworks. We did not want to rent some sterile, soulless office in a towering glass skyscraper. We wanted a space that felt grounded and authentic, a physical representation of the integrity we intended to bring to our work. After weeks of searching, we found the perfect location in the West Loop. It was a beautifully restored brick loft with massive industrial windows, exposed wooden beams, and an open floor plan that encouraged genuine collaboration. We spent the first month designing the infrastructure, outfitting the space with top-tier, impenetrable server networks that rivaled federal intelligence agencies. We named the firm Vanguard Digital Forensics. There was no mention of my maiden name or his discarded family name on the frosted glass doors. It was an entirely new entity, built on a foundation of clean money and absolute transparency. When it came time to hire our initial team, we intentionally looked past the polished resumes from Ivy League universities. We sought out brilliant, unconventional analysts who had been overlooked by massive corporate machines. We built a diverse team of digital investigators who shared my relentless, obsessive drive for the truth. There were no golden children in our office, no nepotism, and no toxic power dynamics. Everyone was valued solely on their merit, their work ethic, and their dedication to uncovering financial corruption. Word of our new firm spread through the financial sector with remarkable speed. The corporate world had a very long memory, and my reputation as the auditor who single-handedly brought down the Kensington Empire acted as the ultimate marketing tool. Within our first 3 months of operation, we were approached by 2 Fortune 500 companies looking to overhaul their security protocols. They did not want traditional accounting firms that would rubber stamp their ledgers. They wanted the woman who could spot an $80 million discrepancy buried under 6 layers of international encryption. Cameron thrived in his new role as our director of operations. Shedding the oppressive weight of his family's expectations had transformed him completely. He approached client negotiations with a calm, grounded confidence entirely free from the aggressive, cutthroat tactics his brother had always utilized. Clients respected his straightforward honesty, and our retention rate was flawless. We were working long, demanding hours, but the exhaustion felt profoundly different now. It was not the soul-crushing fatigue of trying to prove my worth to people who viewed me as disposable. It was the deeply satisfying exhaustion of building a massive, thriving enterprise that belonged entirely to us. In the evenings, we would sit together in my spacious new office, sharing takeout food and reviewing case files, surrounded by a team that actually respected and supported one another. We had taken the trauma his mother and brother had inflicted upon us and metabolized it into a driving, unstoppable force for good. By the end of our first year, Vanguard Digital Forensics had expanded to include 40 employees, handling highly sensitive, multi-million-dollar investigations across the globe. We were frequently collaborating with federal regulatory agencies, providing the technical expertise they required to dismantle complex corporate fraud rings that had evaded detection for decades. We had moved completely out of the dark, suffocating shadow of the Kensington name. That toxic legacy felt like a distant, faded nightmare belonging to a past life that no longer held any power over our daily reality. I was no longer the overlooked daughter-in-law forced to endure cruel insults over holiday dinners. I was the founder and chief executive officer of one of the most respected cybersecurity firms in the country. Every single morning when I walked through the frosted glass doors of our agency, I felt a deep, resonant sense of pride in what we had accomplished. We had built an empire based on actual hard work, relentless integrity, and the unshakable belief that the truth will always eventually come to light. I had proven that true power does not come from inherited wealth, arrogance, or the willingness to destroy others for gain. True power comes from knowing exactly what you are capable of when the absolute worst happens, and choosing to build something magnificent from the ashes. I stood by the expansive windows of my corner office, looking out over the vibrant, bustling streets of Chicago. The afternoon sun cast a warm, golden glow across the city skyline. I took a deep breath, feeling a profound sense of closure settling over my heart. The ghosts of the past had finally been laid to rest. For 8 months, that peace remained completely undisturbed. I was sitting at my sprawling mahogany desk, reviewing a finalized forensic report for a major client. The corner office offered a breathtaking view of the city skyline. The late afternoon sun reflected off the glass and steel architecture, casting light across the polished hardwood floors. I took a sip of my coffee, savoring the quiet satisfaction of a job perfectly executed. The profound silence of my office was suddenly broken by the sharp ringing of my private desk line. This was a direct, unlisted number given only to high-priority clients and federal contacts. I did not even look at the caller identification display as I picked up the heavy receiver. I answered with my standard professional greeting, fully expecting to hear a familiar associate. Instead of a corporate greeting, a cold, automated, heavily recorded voice echoed through the earpiece. The robotic voice announced that I was receiving a collect call from an inmate at the Federal Correctional Institution in Dublin, California. It stated the inmate's name in a dull, digitized monotone, asking if I would accept the charges. I froze the ceramic coffee mug, halting halfway to my lips. My heart skipped a single, involuntary beat as the automated voice repeated the name. Sylvia Kensington. I slowly lowered my cup back onto the desk, the ceramic clinking softly. The rational part of my brain screamed at me to simply hang up the phone. We had legally and emotionally severed all ties to that toxic bloodline. But a deeper curiosity anchored my hand to the receiver. I wanted to hear what absolute defeat sounded like from a woman who believed she was entirely untouchable. I pressed the digit to accept the charges. The line clicked, followed by a harsh, echoing burst of background static. Then a voice came through the receiver. It was a weak, trembling, raspy sound that I almost did not recognize. Whitney Sylvia gasped, her voice completely stripped of its trademark aristocratic arrogance. "Please do not hang up the phone. Please just listen to me for 1 minute." I leaned back in my leather chair, keeping my breathing perfectly slow and measured. I did not offer a polite greeting. I simply waited in the heavy, unforgiving silence, forcing her to speak into the void. Sylvia let out a pathetic, shuddering sob that rattled through the poor connection. She sounded completely broken. She began to speak in a fast, frantic, disjointed rush. She told me the conditions in the federal penitentiary were absolutely horrific. She said her public defender was entirely useless and refused to file the necessary appeals to challenge her conspiracy convictions. I listened to her desperate rambling, feeling absolutely nothing. There was no sympathy, no lingering fear, and no residual anger. I simply felt an overwhelming sense of profound detachment. "Whitney, I am begging you," Sylvia cried, her voice cracking as true desperation bled into her words. "I know you received a massive financial bounty from the government. I saw the business articles in the prison library. You have millions of dollars now. You have your own massive company. Please, I just need you to hire me a real defense attorney. I cannot survive in this place for 20 years. I will not make it." I remained silent, letting her pathetic pleas echo in my office. When she realized I was not going to immediately respond, she fell back on the only manipulative tactic she had ever known. She tried to invoke the bond of blood and loyalty. "We made terrible mistakes," Whitney Sylvia sobbed, her words slurring together in her panic. "But underneath it all, we are still connected. Cameron is still my son. You are still my daughter-in-law. Please, you have to help me. Family needs to stick together when things get difficult." A slow, cold smile spread across my face. I looked out the windows at the skyline, taking in the view of the empire Cameron and I had built. I thought about the dark, terrifying night in the hospital, the freezing rain in the industrial garage, and the absolute ruthlessness of her international escape plan. I pressed the receiver closer to my ear, ensuring my voice would be perfectly clear over the terrible prison connection. "You told me I was not family, Sylvia," I said, my tone as sharp as broken glass. "You looked me right in the eyes while my husband was in a coma and told me that the strong protect the strong. You told me I was never one of you." I paused, letting the profound weight of my words settle over the line. I heard her panicked breathing hitch in her throat. "You were absolutely right," I continued, my voice dropping to a deadly quiet whisper. "I was never part of your family. I am the karma you did not see coming." Before she could utter another syllable, I pulled the receiver away from my ear and slammed it down onto the cradle. The heavy click severed the connection. I picked up my cell phone, accessed the administrative settings for my private desk line, and blocked the federal penitentiary's incoming routing number. The heavy oak door to my office clicked open. Cameron stepped into the room holding 2 fresh files and wearing a perfectly tailored suit. He looked healthy, vibrant, and completely at peace. He glanced at the phone on my desk, then looked up at my face, a silent question in his dark eyes. I stood up from my desk, smoothing the front of my jacket. I walked across the polished hardwood floor, closed the distance between us, and wrapped my arms around my husband. I told him it was absolutely nothing important, just a wrong number trying to reach a business that no longer existed. I took his hand, turned my back on the phone, and walked out into the bustling, vibrant hallway of our thriving agency, leaving the past exactly where it belonged. The greatest lesson I learned from watching the Kensington Empire crumble is that true power has absolutely nothing to do with inherited wealth, designer clothes, or an arrogant last name. For years, Sylvia and Derek believed their privilege made them untouchable. They looked down on me, assuming my quiet dedication and middle-class background made me weak, disposable, and easily manipulated. They mistook my silence for submission and my profession for a trivial hobby. But arrogance is the ultimate vulnerability. When you believe you are superior to everyone else, you leave the doors to your own destruction wide open. They handed me the keys to their kingdom because they simply could not fathom that the quiet auditor possessed the intelligence to dismantle their entire lives. When crisis strikes, it strips away every polished facade and reveals exactly who people really are. Blood does not make a family. Loyalty, sacrifice, and showing up when the world is falling apart is what truly defines family. Cameron and I lost the toxic illusion of his relatives, but in the ashes of their betrayal, we found our true strength. We built an empire of our own, not through theft or deceit, but through absolute integrity and relentless hard work. You do not have to accept the role of the victim just because someone powerful tries to force you into it. You always have the power to rewrite your own ending. Have you ever been underestimated by toxic people who thought they could control or ruin you? How did you turn the tables and reclaim your power? Share your stories in the comments below. If my journey resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe for more stories about surviving betrayal and building your own empire.